My twin brother called me crying at 2 in the morning. When I found out his wife had controlled and abused him for 46 years, pushing him to the edge of ending his own life. I drove to his cheap motel and switched places with him. I am a retired forensic financial auditor. I spent my life dismantling corrupt corporations. Now I was going to dismantle her. The phone ringing at 2 in the morning never brings good news. I picked it up expecting a wrong number or a telemarketer. Instead, I heard my twin brother Lawrence sobbing uncontrollably. The sound was foreign, unnerving, like a machine grinding its own gears to dust. I was standing on the rusted balcony of a rundown motel off Interstate 95, holding a bottle of prescription pills. His wife Patricia was forcing him to sign over his life insurance policy the next morning. If he signed it, she would cash out his only remaining safety net. If he refused, she had already prepared fraudulent medical documents to have him permanently committed to a state psychiatric facility. He told me he was tired of fighting. He told me he was just going to swallow the pills, jump over the railing, and let her have the payout so he could finally rest. I told him to stay where he was. Lawrence and I share the same face, the same voice, and the same 74 years on this earth, but our paths split decades ago. He always yielded. He chose the quiet suburban life, married young, and surrendered his spine for the illusion of a peaceful home. I chose the bloodbath of corporate finance. I spent my career hunting down embezzlers, tracing shell companies across international borders, and tearing apart arrogant executives in deposition rooms. I learned early on that weakness invites predators. Lawrence had bled himself dry to appease a woman who saw him as nothing more than a walking ATM. I drove an hour through the freezing rain, my knuckles white on the steering wheel, and kicked down his motel door. Lawrence looked like a ghost. He was hollowed out, shivering, wearing a frayed canvas jacket that offered no protection against the winter wind. I took the bottle of pills from his shaking hands and tossed them over the balcony into the dark parking lot. In 10 minutes, the plan was set. I gave him the keys to my secluded cabin upstate and my black credit card. I ordered him to disappear, to buy whatever he needed, and to ignore his phone. I took his frayed jacket, his cheap analog watch, and the brass keys to his house. I drove his rusted sedan back to the house he had paid off decades ago, the house where he had been treated like a stray dog. I parked in the driveway, inserted the brass key into the front door, and stepped inside. The moment the hinges creaked, a plastic bucket swung out from the shadows. A torrent of ice water slammed into my face. The freezing shock hit my chest, soaking through the thin canvas jacket and freezing my skin instantly. I gasped for air, wiping the stinging water from my eyes. Patricia stood in the hallway holding the empty bucket. She glared at me with unfiltered disgust, her jaw set in a rigid line of malice. "You are 3 minutes late for your curfew," she sneered, her voice dripping with venom. "If you ever walk out of this house again without my permission, I will lock you out in the snow for good. Now clean up this mess and get out of my sight." I did not wipe the freezing water from my face. I did not yell. I simply looked down at the puddle forming on the hardwood floor. In the corporate world, when a hostile takeover begins, the very first rule is to assess the enemy defenses without alerting them to your strategy. I grabbed a dirty towel from the hallway rack and slowly dropped to my knees, wiping the floor. As I moved, I mapped the house. A blinking red light in the corner of the ceiling caught my eye. A camera. Another one was mounted above the wooden staircase. Patricia had turned this suburban home into a surveillance state to monitor her captive husband 24 hours a day. She walked past me, deliberately stepping on my wet hand with her heel. I did not flinch, but my eyes locked onto her shoes. Red soles, custom Italian leather. They were easily worth $2,000. Lawrence had told me she constantly berated him for not earning enough, claiming they were broke and drowning in utility bills, yet she was parading around the house in footwear that cost more than his entire monthly pension. "Go to the basement," she snapped, not bothering to look back. "And do not even think about coming up here tonight." She tossed something onto the floor next to my dirty towel. It was a heel of bread hard as a rock, dotted with green mold along the crust. "Eat it or starve," she said, slamming the master bedroom door and locking the deadbolt from the inside. I picked up the moldy bread. I did not throw it away. I wrapped it carefully in a napkin and placed it in my pocket. Evidence. The basement was damp, smelling heavily of mildew and rotting wood. A thin, miserable cot lay in the corner beneath a flickering fluorescent bulb. This was how my brother lived. This was his reward for 46 years of loyalty. I sat in the darkness, ignoring my soaked clothes, letting the cold seep into my bones. The physical discomfort meant nothing. It only fueled the cold, calculating fire burning in my chest. At 6 the next morning, the front door crashed open, hitting the drywall with a thud. Footsteps pounded against the floorboards right above my head. I walked up the basement stairs just as Stephen, my 35-year-old nephew, stormed into the kitchen. He slammed his fist against the marble island, making the coffee mugs rattle. "Where is it?" he screamed, spit flying from his lips. "I owe 30 grand by Friday, you old fool. Give me the money or I swear I will break your jaw right now." I was sweating profusely, his eyes bloodshot, reeking of cheap alcohol, stale smoke, and desperation. A degenerate gambler. Stephen lunged forward, grabbing me by the collar of my damp jacket. His knuckles dug painfully into my collarbone, pinning me against the refrigerator door. "You are going to log into your retirement account right now." He hissed, his breath hot and sour against my face. "If you do not give me the password, Mom and I are tossing you into the Sunnyside psychiatric ward by Monday morning. We already have the fake evaluation paperwork signed. We will lock you in a padded room, take power of attorney, and drain the account anyway. Make it easy on yourself." I let my hands tremble. I widened my eyes, forcing my breathing to quicken, playing the role of the broken, terrified father he expected to see. "Please," I whispered, keeping my voice frail and shaky. "The password is my birthday, month and year." Stephen shoved me backward, sending my shoulder crashing against the appliance. "You owe me this, you worthless failure," he spat, pointing a trembling finger at my face. 3 years ago you stalled on selling that piece of garbage vintage truck, and I almost got my legs broken by my bookie. You are going to pay for that delay for the rest of your miserable life." He stormed out of this kitchen, pulling out his smartphone to quickly access the financial portal. I watched the front door slam shut behind him. The trembling in my hands vanished instantly. I stood up straight, rolled my shoulders back, and adjusted my collar. 3 years ago, Lawrence had sold a beautifully restored vintage Chevrolet truck that we had rebuilt together in our 20s. He had told me he needed the money to cover unexpected medical bills. Now the truth was laid bare. He sold his most prized possession to pay off this parasite's gambling debts, and the parasite was back for more blood. Stephen would not find a secret decoy retirement account. He would find a rejected login. The password I gave him was deliberately wrong. Repeated failed attempts would lock Lawrence's real portal and trigger a security alert to the registered contact. I was buying time and creating a record that Stephen's device had tried to access an account he was not authorized to control. Patricia walked into the kitchen wearing a luxurious silk robe, sipping a fresh espresso. She watched Stephen peel out of the driveway from the window, then turned her cold, apathetic eyes to me. "You should have given him the money faster," she said, taking a delicate sip from her porcelain cup. "You upset my son. Since you want to be difficult and selfish, let us see how you handle the winter." She walked over to the digital thermostat on the wall, pressed a rapid sequence of buttons, and disabled the heating zone for the basement. Outside, the morning sky was gray, and the snow was beginning to fall, and the temperature was dropping well below freezing. "Enjoy your weekend in the icebox," she said, smiling thinly, as she turned her back and walked back to the comfort of her heated bedroom. By midnight, the basement was in freezer. The concrete walls radiated a bone-chilling cold that threatened to induce hypothermia. Every breath I took materialized into a white cloud of vapor in the dark room. Patricia thought the plunging temperature would break me, forcing me to crawl up the wooden stairs and beg for her mercy. She forgot that before I wore tailored Italian suits and dismantled billion-dollar hedge funds, I was a mechanic in a freezing garage. I knew how to survive, and I knew how to work with my hands. I pulled a small, sturdy metal hairpin from the lining of my wallet. I crept silently up the basement stairs in the pitch black and knelt before the locked door. It took me less than 30 seconds to pick the cheap lock. The mechanical click was barely audible over the sound of the howling wind outside. I slipped into the dark hallway, moving like a ghost past Patricia's bedroom door. I could hear her steady, untroubled snoring from inside. I needed leverage. I needed to map out the financial arteries of this corrupt household before I severed them. I bypassed the living room security cameras by keeping to the blind spots I had calculated earlier that morning. I slipped into Patricia's private home office and gently closed the solid oak door behind me. I ran my calloused fingers over the edges of the desk, checking the drawers. They were locked, but they were flimsy. I bypassed them. People who wear $2,000 designer shoes and cut off the heating to punish their spouses do not keep their deepest, most destructive secrets in basic desk drawers. They keep them buried under their feet. I moved the Persian rug aside and knocked my knuckles against the hardwood floorboards until I heard a distinct, hollow thud. I pried up the loose board. A hidden floor safe lay embedded in the foundation. The digital keypad required a 6-digit code. I pulled a small vial of graphite powder from my pocket, lightly dusted the keypad, and blew the excess powder away. The natural oils from her fingers illuminated 4 specific numbers. It took me only 3 quick attempts to arrange them into her wedding anniversary date. A date she clearly only remembered for security purposes. The metal door clicked open with a satisfying mechanical snap. Inside, I found a thick stack of legal documents wrapped in rubber bands. I pulled out a small pen flashlight, biting it between my teeth, and scanned the pages. My blood ran cold, then boiled with an intense, quiet rage. Patricia had secretly taken out 3 separate mortgages on this house using forged power of attorney signatures. She had bled the equity of my brother's lifelong home dry. But that was not the most damning part. I flipped to the final page of the newest, most aggressive loan agreement. The debt was maturing in 10 days. If it was not paid in full, the house would be foreclosed and seized. I looked at the creditor's name at the very top of the deed. It was not a registered bank. It was a private lending firm, a shell company registered in Delaware with 0 public contact information. I knew what this was. She had bypassed legal institutions and borrowed dirty money from predatory private lenders to fund her lavish lifestyle and Stephen's endless gambling debts, using my brother's home as the ultimate collateral. I took out my phone and photographed every page with perfect clarity. I captured every forged signature, every hidden offshore account routing number, and every predatory loan term she had foolishly agreed to. I placed the documents back as I found them, locked the safe, wiped the keypad clean, and covered it with the rug. The morning light filtered through the velvet drapes of Patricia's pristine mahogany study, casting long shadows across the floorboards. I sat at her desk still. In my left inner coat pocket, the untraceable burner phone I had brought from my cabin felt like a loaded weapon against my ribs. The hidden floor safe had yielded the fraudulent mortgages the night before, but in the world of forensic auditing, the devil is always hiding in the daily ledgers. Fraud is rarely an event. It is a slow, methodical bleed. I pulled a simple steel tension wrench from my wallet and slid it into the lock of the bottom right desk drawer. A soft click echoed in the quiet room. Inside lay a crimson leather-bound notebook. Arrogant people always keep physical ledgers because they are infatuated with the tactile sensation of their own greed. They like to hold their stolen wealth in their hands. I opened the thick red cover. Columns of numbers marched down the lined pages in Patricia's aggressive handwriting. My eyes, trained by decades of dismantling corrupt corporations, identified the anomaly. I traced the outgoing wire transfers. They were originating from a joint checking account, but the routing numbers matched the specific medical savings trust Lawrence had mentioned to me years ago. My twin brother had suffered a severe coronary block 5 years prior. He had worked extra shifts at the garage, saving every spare dollar to build that fund for his ongoing cardiac care and a potential emergency bypass surgery. It was his lifeline. Patricia was draining it dry. $5,000 on the 12th of October. $8,000 on the 4th of November. $10,000 just 3 weeks ago. I followed the money trail across the page to the recipient column. The beneficiary was Amanda, their 30-year-old daughter. The transaction memos scrawled in the margins were not for hospital bills or debt relief. They read Milan Villa Rental Paris Shopping District and first-class upgrades. My brother was quite literally coughing up his heart medication money so his daughter could drink vintage champagne on a balcony in Italy. A cold rage crystallized in my chest. I pulled the slick black burner phone from my jacket. I snapped crisp, high-resolution photographs of every page capturing the dates, the amounts, and the brazen memos. The digital shutter clicked silently. I encrypted the image files and transmitted them to a secure offshore server monitored by my attorney, Winston. Winston was a shark who wore tailored suits and spoke very little. I knew he was sitting in his Manhattan office right now, sipping black coffee, receiving these files, and building the ironclad fraud case that would soon suffocate this entire family. A loud metallic clatter shattered the quiet morning. A suitcase slammed against the hardwood floor of the foyer outside the study. The front door swung shut with a thud that rattled the picture frames on the walls. I slipped the red notebook back into the drawer, locked it seamlessly, and pocketed my phone. I stepped out of the study and walked toward the entrance hall, instantly adjusting my posture. I rounded my shoulders, lowered my chin, and let my hands tremble slightly, mimicking Lawrence's defeated, broken slump. Amanda stood in the hallway, dragging a designer suitcase across the polished wood. She wore oversized designer sunglasses and a beige cashmere coat that easily cost 3 months of Lawrence's pension. Beside her stood Jared, her husband. Jared was a man who reeked of cheap cologne entitlement and unearned confidence. He dropped a set of golf clubs onto the floor, deliberately scuffing the expensive varnish. Amanda pulled down her sunglasses and glared at me. Her expression was a flawless carbon copy of her mother's permanent disdain. She did not offer a greeting. She did not ask how I was feeling. She simply crossed her arms and let out an exaggerated, exasperated sigh. "Where is my mother?" she demanded, her voice and grating. I kept my gaze fixed on the scuff mark Jared had just left on the floor. "She went to the salon," I replied, making sure my voice sounded frail and exhausted. Amanda rolled her eyes and kicked off her shoes. "Whatever. Listen to me, because I am only going to say this once. Jared and I are moving in. Our luxury apartment lease expired, and the landlord refused to renew it because he is being unreasonable about some missed payments. We need to save money for our new business venture, so we are taking over the house." Jared smirked, stepping forward with his hands resting casually on his hips. He looked around the living room as if he was measuring the square footage for a demolition project. "It is about time we got some use out of this place," he said, ignoring my presence. "The layout is outdated, but we can fix that once we clear out the junk." Amanda pointed her manicured finger at my chest. "Go upstairs and pack your things right now. We are taking the master suite. You need to clear out all your clothes and your useless tools. You can move into the basement permanently. If it is too cold down there, figure it out, or go find a shelter. We have a delivery of imported Italian furniture arriving on Tuesday, and I refuse to have your depressing energy ruining my new living space." I did not raise my voice. I did not argue. I let the silence stretch for a brief moment, playing the role of the broken old man who had surrendered his dignity. I nodded slowly, keeping my eyes fixed firmly on the ground. Jared let out a loud, mocking laugh. He stepped closer and slapped me hard on the shoulder, a deliberately humiliating and degrading physical gesture designed to establish dominance. "Good man," Jared sneered. "While you are at it, carry these bags upstairs for us. My back is killing me from the flight, and you clearly have nothing better to do today." I walked over to the leather handle of Amanda's designer suitcase. I gripped the thick leather, the immense weight of the luggage. I began to drag the bag up the wooden staircase step by agonizing step. Behind me, I could hear Amanda and Jared laughing, already discussing which walls they were going to tear down. I kept my head down, dragging the weight upward, while my mind calculated the devastating trajectory of their impending ruin. A cardboard box hit the bottom of the wooden staircase and burst open. Faded flannel shirts, a worn shaving kit, and a framed photograph of my brother Lawrence and his late dog spilled across the polished floorboards. I stood at the bottom of the stairs, watching Jared wipe his hands on his expensive denim jeans. He had not just asked me to leave the master suite. He was actively throwing a 74-year-old man's entire life into the hallway like bags of garbage. Amanda stood right behind him, casually sipping sparkling water from a glass. She did not even flinch as her father's personal belongings scattered across the floor. Jared walked down the steps, his imported sneakers deliberately the corner of the picture frame. The glass cracked loudly, a sound that echoed in the high-ceilinged foyer. He kicked the broken frame aside and pointed toward a narrow, unremarkable door near the kitchen. It led to the utility storage room. The utility room was no bigger than a walk-in closet. It smelled heavily of bleach-old mops and damp concrete. A rusted folding cot was wedged tightly between a humming water heater and a stack of plastic storage bins. This was where Amanda believed her father deserved to spend his remaining years. I placed the broken picture frame gently on top of a plastic bin. I sat on the edge of the cot and listened to the footsteps above me as Jared and Amanda marched back and forth, loudly claiming the largest bedroom in the house. That evening, Patricia ordered expensive imported sushi from a high-end restaurant downtown, paying with the very credit cards I was already tracking through my offshore servers. The dining room table was set with fine china and crystal glasses. I was not invited to sit with them. Patricia pointed a manicured finger to a small wooden stool in the corner of the kitchen, right next to the stainless steel trash can. She handed me a flimsy paper plate, holding a few leftover pieces of plain white rice and a packet of soy sauce. Jared sat at the head of the table, a position of authority that rightfully belonged to the man whose house he was squatting in. He chewed his food loudly, swirling a glass of expensive red wine. He looked over his shoulder at me, sitting silently in the corner, and let out a cruel, mocking smirk. "It is honestly funny," Jared said, projecting his voice so it would carry clearly into the kitchen. "Some men actually build empires. They create wealth. Others just take up space and breathe up the expensive air conditioning. It is a very good thing Amanda and I are moving in to actually add some real value to this property." Patricia laughed, and grating sound that filled the room. Amanda quickly chimed in, agreeing loudly that her father had never possessed a head for business, calling his 40 years of hard work unremarkable. They bonded over their shared cruelty, uniting under the banner of their own perceived superiority. I kept my head down, slowly eating the cold rice. I did not feel humiliated. I felt predatory. I needed them comfortable. I needed them arrogant. Arrogance creates blind spots, and they were staring blindly into mine. When the lavish dinner ended, Patricia ordered me to clear the table and wash every dish by hand. The three of them moved to the living room, pouring more wine and turning up the volume on the flat-screen television. I gathered the fine china, the crystal glasses, and the empty platters as I wiped down the oak dining table with a damp cloth. I reached into the waistband of my trousers. Before arriving at this house, my attorney Winston had provided me with several pieces of tactical surveillance equipment. I pulled out a micro-voice recorder no larger than a standard quarter. It was equipped with a sensitive voice-activated sensor and a duty magnetic backing. I dropped my cleaning cloth onto the rug, knelt down, as if picking up a dropped fork, and pressed the small device firmly against the underside of the table, right beneath where Jared had been sitting. The strong magnet locked into the metal framing with a silent, satisfying grip. I picked up the cloth, finished wiping the table, and quietly returned to my designated closet. Hours later, the house finally fell silent. The television was off, and the footsteps upstairs had ceased. I sat in the damp utility room, the low mechanical hum of the water heater vibrating steadily against my spine. I pulled out my secure burner phone and quickly synced it to the micro-recorder's encrypted frequency. I put a wireless earbud into my right ear and pressed play on the audio file. The digital audio was crystal clear. I fast-forwarded past the dull clinking of silverware and the arrogant dinner conversation, moving to a late-night recording, triggered long after Patricia had gone to sleep. It was just Jared and Amanda sitting back at the dining table, their voices low, urgent, and conspiratorial. "We need to get her to sign it by Friday." Jared was whispering, his tone laced with a frantic anxiety that had not been there during dinner. "The commercial lenders are not going to hold the capital offer forever. They need a property guarantor on record." "I know," Amanda replied, her voice tight and nervous. "But my mother is paranoid about her credit score and her assets. If she realizes we are asking her to personally guarantee a high-risk commercial business loan, she will throw us out onto the street tonight." "She is not going to realize a thing," Jared sneered, his confidence returning. "We just bury the personal guarantee clause right in the middle of the fake kitchen renovation permits. She signs without reading half the paperwork anyway, especially if she thinks it increases the property value. Once her legal signature is on that debt, the bank releases the $500,000 to our corporate account, and we are gone. We take the cash move out of state and leave her holding the bag when the business conveniently files for bankruptcy in 6 months." I paused the audio file. The dark, cramped utility room suddenly felt warm. Amanda and Jared were not just moving in to save money on rent. They were actively plotting to deceive Patricia into legally anchoring herself to a fraudulent commercial loan. They were planning to take the cash and flee, executing the same kind of financial destruction Patricia was inflicting upon Lawrence. They were going to leave her to face foreclosure and financial ruin. The utility room was dark when the oak front door slammed open. Frantic footsteps echoed across the ceiling, followed by the undeniable sound of a woman crying. I stood up from the rusted cot and cracked the wooden door open just an inch. Peering through the narrow gap, I saw Natalie pacing the hallway. Natalie was Stephen's wife. She looked exhausted, wearing a faded winter coat, her eyes red and puffy from crying. Stephen had stormed out yesterday, demanding money for his gambling debts. Now, his desperate wife had come to beg for the same thing. Patricia glided into the hallway, holding a steaming cup of tea. She wore a pristine white silk robe and expensive velvet slippers. She did not offer Natalie a seat. She simply stood near the bottom of the staircase, looking down at her daughter-in-law with an expression of disgust. Natalie pleaded with her, her voice shaking. She told Patricia that the people Stephen owed money to came to their apartment this morning. They threatened her. They said if they did not pay the $30,000 by Friday, they were going to hurt him severely. Natalie begged her mother-in-law, saying she knew Patricia had the money in the medical trust. Patricia took a slow sip of her tea. She let the silence hang in the air, allowing Natalie to squirm in her own humiliation. Finally, Patricia spoke. She told Natalie she was pathetic. Her voice was cold and void of empathy. She said Stephen was a grown man, and if he was stupid enough to borrow money from street thugs, he could face the consequences like a man. Patricia explicitly stated she was not going to drain her personal finances to bail out a degenerate gambler and his enabling wife. Natalie wiped her face and stepped closer. She argued that Stephen was her son and that the thugs were going to break his legs or worse. She cried out that she had seen the bank statements on the kitchen counter last month and knew the account was full. Patricia laughed. It was a cruel sound that echoed off the high walls. She sneered and said that money was for her future, not a charity fund for failures. She ordered Natalie to get out of her house and never come back begging again. Patricia turned her back, walked upstairs to the master suite, and locked the door loudly behind her. Natalie collapsed onto the bottom step of the staircase, burying her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably into the quiet house. I opened the utility room door and shuffled slowly into the hallway. I kept my shoulders slumped and my gaze fixed on the floor, mimicking my twin brother Lawrence. I walked past Natalie pretending to be searching for a broom in the corner. I let out an exaggerated sigh. I stopped and whispered that I was so sorry. I kept my voice frail and shaky, telling her I wished I could help her and Stephen. Natalie looked up, her eyes filled with tears and deep resentment. She viewed Lawrence as a weak, useless old man, subservient to Patricia. She muttered angrily that I could not do anything anyway. She said Patricia controlled every penny in the house and would rather watch her own son get killed than part with $1. I stopped walking. I turned to face her, widening my eyes slightly to play the part of a confused, naive old man who was just accidentally thinking out loud. I murmured softly that I just did not understand. I told Natalie that Patricia had said the account was empty. I casually mentioned that Patricia told me she had to send all the remaining $10,000 to Amanda last week. Natalie froze. The crying stopped instantly. She stood up from the stairs, her breath hitching in her throat. She asked me what I had just said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. I took a step back, pretending to be terrified that I had spoken out of turn. I babbled nervously, saying I should not have said anything, and begging her not to tell Patricia. I explained that Patricia told me Amanda needed emergency funds for her luxury vacation rental in Italy. I told Natalie I saw the red notebook in the study, where Patricia writes down all the wire transfers. I whimpered that I just thought she did not have anything left to give Stephen, and apologized again for being a confused old man. I turned around and shuffled quickly back into the kitchen, keeping my head down. Behind me, the silence in the hallway was deafening. The sorrow and fear in Natalie had evaporated. It was instantly replaced by a blinding, explosive rage. Patricia was refusing to save her son's life, while simultaneously funding her daughter's luxury European vacation with the same medical trust fund. I watched the reflection in the stainless steel oven door. Natalie did not leave the house. She marched into the living room. Her breathing was erratic. She began tearing through the drawers of the wooden console tables. She pulled out stacks of mail, threw decorative boxes onto the floor, and ripped through Patricia's personal organizers looking for the red ledger I had conveniently mentioned. She was a desperate woman searching for proof of the ultimate betrayal. She moved to the tall mahogany bookshelf in the corner of the living room, pulling down binders and tossing them onto the rug. She reached the top shelf, sweeping her arm across the wooden surface to clear the decorations. A ceramic vase plummeted from the top shelf. It crashed onto the hardwood floor, shattering into dozens of pieces. Hidden inside that specific vase was the primary wide-angle security camera that Patricia used to monitor the entire living room and front entrance. I had spotted its blinking red light on my very first night in the house. The impact destroyed the lens and severed the internal wiring. The blinking red light flickered once and died. Natalie froze, staring at the broken ceramic pieces and the exposed electronic wires. Panic flashed across her face. She realized she had just destroyed Patricia's expensive surveillance equipment while snooping through her things. Without looking back, she grabbed her coat, ran out the front door, and fled down the driveway as fast as she could. Patricia stood in the center of the living room, staring down at the shattered ceramic pieces scattered across the polished hardwood floor. Her face was pale, not out of sadness for the broken vase, but out of unfiltered paranoia. The exposed, frayed wires of her hidden security camera mocked her from the wreckage. She spun around, her eyes darting across the shadows of the house, searching the perimeter for an intruder. She marched to the utility room, threw the wooden door open, and glared at me. I sat on the rusted folding cot, keeping my hands neatly folded in my lap, playing the perfect role of the oblivious, terrified old man. She demanded to know who had been in the living room. She screamed, asking if I had dared to touch her personal belongings. I shrank back against the damp concrete wall, lowering my voice to a frightened, shaky whisper, and told her I had been locked in the basement the entire afternoon. She did not believe me, but she had no proof. The sudden loss of her surveillance equipment stripped away her sense of dominance over the house. When arrogant people lose control, they do not retreat and reassess. They escalate their cruelty. They resort to brute force to reestablish their power. That evening, the atmosphere in the kitchen was and thick with tension. Patricia did not order expensive takeout as she usually did. Instead, she stood by the marble island, personally preparing a bowl of beef stew. She walked over and placed the ceramic bowl roughly on the small wooden stool next to the stainless steel trash can, my designated dining spot. She stood there, crossing her arms, watching me with a cold, unblinking stare. "Eat it right now," she ordered, her voice devoid of any human emotion. I walked over to the stool and looked down at the dark, steaming broth. In my years of forensic auditing, I learned to identify a deadly trap, not by looking at what is plainly visible, but by focusing on what is slightly out of place. The stew was hot, but beneath the rich aroma of cooked meat and roasted potatoes, there was a faint chemical scent. It smelled bitter, like crushed aspirin mixed with industrial chalk. Patricia was not a woman who cooked warm meals for the husband she openly despised, unless she had a very specific malicious motive. She wanted to sedate me. She wanted to knock me unconscious, neutralizing any perceived threat, while she figured out what happened to her broken camera and secured the house. Patricia turned her back for 10 seconds to pour herself a tall glass of red wine at the marble counter. That narrow window of time was all I needed. Sitting just 3 feet away from my stool was her pampered, purebred hound, greedily eating premium wet food from a designer ceramic bowl on the floor. I moved with a speed and precision that belonged to a man 30 years younger. I grabbed my bowl of tainted stew, scooped a portion of the meat and poisoned broth, and dumped it into the dog's bowl. I used my spoon to quickly and silently mix the rich stew deep into the expensive dog food. The hound swallowed it instantly, swallowing the chemical payload hidden inside the meat. I wiped my spoon clean on my paper napkin and took a tiny superficial bite of a plain, unsoaked potato from the very edge of my own bowl just as Patricia turned back around to face me. I forced my hand to tremble. I let the metal spoon clatter loudly against the ceramic rim. I closed my eyes halfway, letting my head droop heavily forward, as if a sudden exhaustion was pulling me toward the floor. Patricia watched me intently, taking a slow, satisfied sip of her wine. A cruel, triumphant smile spread across her lips. "Go back to your closet," she commanded softly, enjoying the sight of my fake deterioration. "You look exhausted." I dragged my feet across the kitchen tiles, leaning heavily against the doorframe to support my weight. I stumbled into the dark utility room and let the door click shut behind me. The moment the metal latch engaged, my posture straightened. My mind was clear and fully alert. I sat on the edge of the rusted cot in the darkness, waiting patiently for the morning sun, knowing the ruthless trap she had set for me had just closed brutally on her own prized possession. The screaming started precisely at 6 in the morning. It was not an angry shout or a minor complaint. It was a shrill, hysterical shriek that echoed through the metal ventilation shafts and rattled the copper pipes above my head. I stood up and opened the utility room door just a fraction of an inch. Patricia was kneeling on the cold kitchen tiles, still wearing her expensive silk nightgown, shaking the body of her purebred hound. The dog was unresponsive. It lay rigidly on its side, breathing in shallow, ragged gasps. Its eyes rolled back into its head. The dose of sedatives was meant to incapacitate a grown man had overwhelmed the animal's system overnight. Patricia was hyperventilating, tears of genuine panic streaming down her face. She pulled her smartphone from her pocket with trembling hands and dialed a number. She did not call a standard emergency veterinary clinic. She bypassed the standard contacts and called someone on a private line. I reached into my inner jacket pocket, pulled out my encrypted burner phone, and synced it instantly to the micro recorder I had planted under the dining table the previous night. I placed the small wireless earbud deep into my right ear. The live audio feed caught her voice, capturing the terror in her tone. "Pick up," Patricia muttered, pressing the phone against her ear. The line opened, and a sleepy male voice answered. She immediately said the dog had gotten into the food meant for Lawrence and had swallowed the sedative he supplied. Her panic stripped away the caution she usually wrapped around her words. She asked what she was supposed to do before anyone discovered the animal had been exposed to an unprescribed tranquilizer. The man cursed and told her not to bring the dog through the front desk of his clinic without warning. He said the medication was tightly controlled and had never been prescribed to Lawrence. A toxicology screen would identify it, and the paper trail could expose both the source of the drug and Patricia's possession of it. He demanded to know why she had used so much. Patricia snapped that she only needed Lawrence unconscious long enough to keep him from interfering with the paperwork. That sentence was the evidence I had been waiting for. The recorder beneath the dining table captured the call clearly. It did not prove every medical fact by itself, but it connected the sedative. Patricia's food and her plan to neutralize the man she believed was her husband. The supplier told her to get the dog emergency care and warned that he would protect himself if investigators became involved. Then he ended the call. I stood in the darkness of the utility room, a cold, calculating smile forming on my lips. Patricia had not just bought standard sleeping pills to keep her husband quiet. She was actively purchasing illegal-grade chemical restraints from a corrupt veterinarian to forcibly drug my twin brother into a state of artificial dementia. She was systematically and intentionally destroying his cognitive function to justify her fraudulent psychiatric evaluations. She had unwittingly confessed to federal drug offenses right in her own kitchen, and her supplier had just confirmed his active participation in the criminal conspiracy on a crystal-clear digital recording. The thick, reinforced walls of her meticulously constructed prison were not just cracking under the pressure. They were actively collapsing around her, and she had just handed me the sledgehammer to deliver the final blow. The brass knocker on the front door echoed through the quiet house just after 10 in the morning. I was sitting on the edge of the rusted cot in the utility room when Patricia's footsteps clicked across the polished hardwood floor above my head. I stood up and walked slowly into the hallway, keeping my shoulders heavily hunched and my gaze fixed firmly on the baseboards. I needed to embody the defeat of a man who had given up on his own life. Patricia opened the wooden door to reveal a man carrying a scuffed leather briefcase. He wore a cheap, poorly tailored gray suit that bunched awkwardly at the shoulders and a pair of badly scuffed loafers. He did not look like a licensed medical professional or a respected psychiatrist. He looked like a man who spent his afternoons at the dog track and his evenings actively dodging aggressive debt collectors. This was the corrupt specialist Patricia had hired to evaluate my mental competency and strip away my legal rights. Patricia did not greet him with standard pleasantries or offer him a cup of coffee. She ushered him inside, quickly checking the street behind him with paranoid eyes before slamming the door shut. She pointed a manicured finger at me, ordering me to step into the living room and sit in the center of the beige sofa. I shuffled forward, dragging my feet the way Lawrence used to do when he was physically and emotionally exhausted from her endless abuse. I sat down heavily on the cushions, letting my hands rest limply in my lap. I stared blankly at the dark television screen mounted on the wall, letting my jaw hang slightly loose. In my previous career as a financial auditor, I spent decades sitting across long mahogany conference tables from pathological liars and desperate embezzlers. I knew how to manipulate human body language to project surrender and confusion. The man dropped his briefcase onto the floor and sat in the armchair opposite me. He did not introduce himself. He did not ask for my medical history or inquire about any previous symptoms. He simply pulled a digital voice recorder from his jacket pocket, placed it deliberately on the glass coffee table, and pressed the red record button. He cleared his throat loudly and stated for the recording that he was conducting a standard cognitive evaluation on Lawrence. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and asked me to state my full name and my date of birth. I let the silence stretch for an agonizingly long time in the living room. I allowed my eyes to dart nervously around the room, as if I were searching the bare walls for the answers. Finally, I mumbled an incorrect birth year, slurring my syllables heavily to mimic severe neurological decline. I watched Patricia standing by the archway of the kitchen out of the corner of my eye. A tight, victorious smile spread across her face. She was thoroughly enjoying the performance, unaware that I was the one actively directing the play. The fake doctor leaned back his cheap cologne, failing to mask the distinct smell of stale tobacco. He asked me to identify the current year, the current season, and the name of the current president. I stared at his scuffed loafers. I whispered the name of a president who had been out of office for over 20 years. I told him it was the middle of summer in 1998, even though winter rain and old snow were visible outside. I let my voice crack with artificial panic, asking where my vintage truck was the very same truck Lawrence had been forced to sell to pay off Stephen's gambling debts 3 years ago. The unexpected mention of the vintage truck made Patricia roll her eyes in irritation, but the doctor simply nodded in deep satisfaction. He asked me how many children I had. I paused, squinting my eyes tightly, as if my brain was misfiring under the pressure of the question. I told him I only had a daughter. I omitted Stephen from my family history. I claimed I did not know anyone named Stephen, and began to rock back and forth slightly on the sofa cushions. The doctor picked up the digital recorder from the glass table, speaking clearly and loudly into the microphone. He stated for the official record that the patient was demonstrating severe advanced cognitive decline, memory loss, and a complete inability to manage his own personal or financial affairs safely. He declared the evaluation complete and pressed the stop button with a loud final click. I kept my vacant stare locked on the hardwood floor, but I shifted my torso slightly to the left. I needed to ensure the angle was perfect. Before I had driven through the freezing rain to this house, my attorney, Winston, had replaced the top button of my faded flannel shirt with a military-grade micro camera. It was designed to capture high-definition video and audio, transmitting it to the encrypted offshore server located in his Manhattan office. Patricia walked briskly into the living room. She did not ask the doctor for a specialized treatment plan. She did not ask for medication recommendations to help her supposedly ailing husband recover his memory. She walked straight to the glass coffee table and pulled a thick, unmarked manila envelope from the deep pocket of her luxurious silk robe. She dropped it heavily onto the glass surface right next to his briefcase. The doctor did not even bother to check the contents of the envelope. He knew how much cash was inside. He picked up the package, weighing it casually in his hand, and let out a dark smirk. He told Patricia that $5,000 was a steep price for a house call, but considering the legal weight of the document he was about to provide, it was in bargain. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a pre-printed medical certificate of severe mental incompetence. He quickly signed his name at the bottom of the page, stamping it with a fraudulent state medical seal. He handed the report to Patricia and said it could support a petition for control over Lawrence's finances and medical decisions, especially if her lawyer paired it with other documents. It did not itself give Patricia ownership of the house, every account, or the power to silence Lawrence in court. Patricia heard only what she wanted: another piece of paper she could use as leverage. Patricia stood in the center of the living room, holding the signed certificate of mental incompetence in her manicured hands. She was trembling slightly, but not from any sense of sorrow or guilt. She was vibrating with greed. She stared at the piece of paper as if it were a winning lottery ticket that would instantly solve all her financial problems. She ignored me sitting just 5 feet away on the sofa. To her, I was no longer a human being with thoughts or feelings. I was a legally erased entity. I was a ghost occupying space in a house she was preparing to liquidate for maximum profit. She pulled her smartphone from her pocket with rapid, frantic movements. She dialed a number from her recent contacts and pressed the phone hard against her ear. She did not walk away to seek privacy in her study. She felt so untouchable, so certain of my artificial dementia, that she began to orchestrate my final destruction right in front of my face. She commanded the person on the other end of the line to come to the house. She called him by his name, ordering her personal attorney to drop whatever he was doing and drive over to the suburbs. She declared triumphantly that she finally had the certified medical paperwork in her hand. She explicitly instructed him to draft the ultimate irrevocable power of attorney documents. She told him she wanted the paperwork to authorize the immediate liquidation of all real estate assets, the rapid transfer of all remaining pension funds into her private accounts, and the legal authority to place me into a state-run psychiatric facility by the end of the week. She hung up the phone, letting out a breathless laugh of victory. She looked down at me on the couch, her eyes devoid of a shred of humanity or compassion. She told me to get up, go back to my closet in the utility room, and stay out of sight. She said the lawyers were coming, and she did not want my pathetic, depressing face ruining the most lucrative afternoon of her entire life. I stood up slowly from the beige sofa. I dragged my boots across the hardwood floor, keeping my head bowed in submission. I shuffled past her, walking back into the damp, freezing utility room near the kitchen. I closed the wooden door behind me and listened to the metal latch click shut. The moment I was alone in the darkness, my entire posture transformed. I stood straight, rolling my shoulders back and taking a deep, calm breath. I reached up and gently adjusted the small, hard plastic button on my flannel shirt. Patricia had just successfully paid a cash bribe to legally erase my brother from existence. She had just summoned a corrupt attorney to finalize the theft of his lifelong home and his hard-earned savings. She truly believed she had just sealed the final lock on my cage, securing her wealthy future forever. She had no idea that she had just enthusiastically handed me the very chains I was going to use to drag her and her entire parasitic family straight into federal prison. The legal trap was set, and she had gleefully walked right into the dead center of it. The footsteps echoing above my head signaled the arrival of the final executioner. Patricia had wasted no time. The corrupt medical certificate confirming my artificial dementia was barely an hour old, and she had already summoned her private attorney to the house. I remained seated in the freezing darkness of the utility room, listening to the muffled voices in the foyer. They were actively discussing the complete liquidation of my brother's life. I reached into the deep inner pocket of my damp canvas jacket. My fingers wrapped around a smooth silver fountain pen. My attorney, Winston, had handed this specific pen to me right before I drove to the rundown motel to rescue Lawrence. Winston handled high-stakes corporate espionage cases. He dealt with hostile takeovers, blackmail, and illegal corporate extortions on a daily basis. He told me the dark blue ink inside this silver cylinder was an unstable chemical compound. It flowed smoothly and looked permanent on paper. But within 48 hours of exposure to the air, the chemical structure would evaporate. It would leave the paper blank, devoid of any signature or indentation. It was a ghost pen designed specifically to sign contracts you fully intended to destroy. The metal latch of the utility room clicked open. Patricia stood in the doorway. She was no longer frantic or angry. She radiated a calm, chilling sense of victory. She wore a tailored black dress and held a crystal glass of expensive champagne. She looked down at me and commanded me to come to the living room. She said it was time to finalize the paperwork. I stood up slowly. I kept my knees bent and my shoulders heavily slouched. I dragged my boots across the hardwood floor, playing the role of a defeated, mentally broken old man who had finally surrendered to his miserable fate. The living room felt like a courtroom prepared for a swift execution. A man in a charcoal suit sat upright on the beige sofa. His expensive leather briefcase rested open on the glass coffee table. He did not stand up when I entered. He did not offer a handshake or a word of common courtesy. He viewed me the way Patricia did. I was simply an obstacle waiting to be legally erased. He arranged a thick stack of legal documents across the glass surface. He tapped a manicured finger against the bottom of the first page. Patricia stood behind the sofa, taking a slow sip of her champagne. The lawyer began to speak. He used dense, complicated legal jargon deliberately designed to confuse and overwhelm a declining mind. He explained that I was signing a full, irrevocable power of attorney. He stated that this document transferred control of all real estate deeds, all remaining pension accounts, and all medical trust funds to Patricia. He added a specific clause, granting her the authority to admit me to any state-run psychiatric facility without any further consent. I kept my eyes wide and vacant. I let my mouth hang slightly open. I nodded slowly, pretending to be confused by the legal terms, but too terrified to ask any questions. The lawyer pulled a cheap plastic pen from his inner pocket and held it out toward me. He ordered me to sign my name on the 6 flagged signature lines. I did not take his plastic pen. I let my hands tremble. I reached into my frayed jacket and pulled out the silver fountain pen Winston had given me. I mumbled in a frail, shaky whisper. I told the lawyer that I only signed important family documents with my special lucky pen. The lawyer frowned in annoyance and looked back at Patricia. Patricia let out a cruel, mocking laugh. She told the lawyer to let the old fool use his little toy. She said it did not matter what pen I used as long as my legal name ended up on the dotted line. The lawyer sighed heavily and pointed to the first signature block. I leaned over the glass coffee table. I uncapped the silver fountain pen. The metal felt cold and powerful in my hands. I pressed the nib against the thick legal paper. I signed my twin brother's name with flawless precision. The dark blue ink bled beautifully onto the page, looking solid and permanent. I moved to the next page and then the next. I signed away the house. I signed away the medical funds. I signed away my brother's fundamental human rights. I played the part. I let out a soft, pathetic whimper as I signed the final page, pretending to mourn the loss of my entire life. Patricia watched me with eyes that gleamed with unparalleled greed. The very second the silver nib lifted from the final dotted line, she lunged forward. She snatched the entire stack of documents right out from under my hands. She held the papers to her chest, her face flushed with triumph. She handed the stack to the corrupt lawyer. The lawyer inspected the dark blue signatures. He nodded in satisfaction. He placed the documents carefully into his leather briefcase, snapped the brass locks shut, and stood up from the sofa. He told Patricia the transfer was official. He promised to file the documents with the county clerk first thing on Monday morning. He walked out the front door without looking back. The front door clicked shut. The silence in the living room was. Patricia turned slowly to face. The fake, tolerant smile she had maintained for the lawyer vanished. It was instantly replaced by a look of hatred. She walked over to the hallway rack and grabbed my frayed canvas jacket. She threw it forcefully, hitting me in the chest. "You are done," she whispered, her voice dripping with venom. "The house is being sold. A commercial developer offered me a cash buyout yesterday, and I intend to close as soon as the authority papers are filed. They want to replace this place with luxury townhouses. I will have the money, I have the power, and I have no use for you anymore." I stood still, clutching the damp jacket against my chest. I asked her in a frail, trembling voice where I was supposed to sleep tonight. Patricia let out a loud, hysterical laugh. She walked over to the wooden front door and threw it wide open. Outside, the sky had turned pitch black. A freezing rain was pouring down, turning the driveway into a river of icy mud. "I do not care where you sleep," Patricia spat, pointing her finger into the freezing storm. "You can sleep in the gutter. You can sleep in a homeless shelter. Or you can finally do us all a favor and walk right into the middle of the highway. You are legally a ghost. You own nothing. Get out of my house right now." I did not argue. I did not beg for mercy. I pulled the frayed jacket over my shoulders and kept my head bowed in defeat. I shuffled slowly past her, feeling the freezing rain hit my face the moment I crossed the threshold. Patricia slammed the oak door behind me. The deadbolt clicked shut with a loud final echo. I stood alone on the wet concrete porch. The freezing rain soaked through my thin clothes in seconds. The wind howled through the barren suburban trees. Anyone else would have felt destroyed. Anyone else would have collapsed onto the icy driveway in despair. But I was not Lawrence. I was Leonard, and I had never felt more alive. The freezing rain battered my shoulders as I walked heavily down the dark suburban street. I did not look back at the oak door Patricia had just slammed shut. The icy wind cut brutally through the frayed canvas jacket I had taken from my brother, but I barely registered the physical discomfort. I had walked 2 blocks when a sleek, heavily armored black Bentley glided silently to the curb. The vehicle's bright halogen headlights cut through the storm, illuminating the flooded asphalt. The rear passenger door swung open smoothly. The plush leather interior radiated a deep, welcoming heat that instantly fought back the freezing dampness of the night. I stepped inside and pulled the armored door shut, leaving the miserable, fabricated life of a broken old man outside in the freezing mud. Winston sat across from me in the spacious rear cabin. My attorney wore an immaculate midnight blue suit and exuded the calm, lethal energy of a man who destroyed corporate empires for a living. He did not ask how my miserable week in the freezing basement had been. He simply reached out and handed me a thick, heated towel and a steaming cup of black coffee from a silver thermos. He tapped the screen of a secured tablet resting on his knees. He informed me that the unstable chemical compound inside the silver fountain pen I had used to sign Patricia's documents was already breaking down. He confirmed that by the time her corrupt attorney proudly filed the paperwork on Monday morning, the expensive legal pages would be blank. I dried my freezing hands with the hot towel and took a slow, deliberate sip of the bitter coffee. The facade of the terrified, confused victim washed away. I was Leonard again. I instructed Winston to pull up the encrypted financial data I had transmitted from Patricia's hidden floor safe and her crimson leather ledger. Winston swiped across the illuminated tablet screen and handed the device to me. The digital files had been meticulously organized by his forensic accounting team over the past 48 hours. Winston explained that Patricia had taken out 3 aggressive mortgages against my brother's house, using expertly forged power of attorney signatures. The final and most dangerous loan was held by a private lending group operating out of a predatory shell company registered in Delaware. He pointed to the highlighted maturation date on the digital document. The balloon payment was due in 10 days. If Patricia failed to produce the enormous sum of cash, the private lenders would seize the property and evict everyone inside. I stared at the glowing numbers on the high-definition screen. Patricia genuinely believed she was an untouchable financial genius simply because she wore custom Italian shoes and bought imported designer sushi. She had no idea how ruthless, predatory corporate lending actually worked. She had arrogantly anchored her entire life to a sinking ship, fully believing she could just steal my brother's medical savings to magically bail herself out. I told Winston to contact the managing director of the Delaware Shell Company right that very second. I instructed him to use my primary offshore investment fund, L&L Holdings. I told him to offer the private lenders a 20% cash premium above market value to buy Patricia's entire debt portfolio. Winston did not blink or question the expenditure. He simply picked up his encrypted satellite phone and dialed a rapid sequence of numbers. He spoke in low, rapid tones, negotiating the hostile buyout with the ruthless mechanical efficiency that made him the most feared attorney in Manhattan. Corporate money moves fast when you offer greedy men a guaranteed cash premium. While Winston expertly secured the mortgage debt over the phone, I turned my attention to the second parasite infesting my brother's home. Stephen, my nephew, was a degenerate gambler, drowning in $30,000 of illicit debt. Natalie had cried in the hallway just a day ago, terrified that the underground bookies were going to break his legs by Friday if he did not produce the cash. I asked Winston if his private security fixers had located the specific criminal syndicate holding Stephen's gambling markers. Winston covered the receiver of his phone for a brief second. He informed me that his contacts had easily found the sleazy bookie operating out of an underground sports betting ring in the city. The man was motivated to sell the debt because Stephen was a notorious liability who constantly missed payments. I instructed Winston to buy Stephen's gambling markers in full using documented investment funds. I told him to purchase the illegal debt under the same corporate umbrella, L&L Holdings. I wanted every financial obligation belonging to this parasitic family consolidated under my unchallenged control. Winston relayed the final instructions into the encrypted phone and ended the call with a swift tap of his finger. He turned to me and confirmed that the wire transfers were processed. Relayed the final instructions into the encrypted phone and ended the call with a swift tap of his finger. He turned to me and confirmed that the wire transfers were processing through our secure international channels. The armored Bentley cruised smoothly down the rain-slicked highway, leaving the chaotic, miserable suburbs fading into the dark rearview mirror. I leaned back into the heated leather seat and watched the green digital progress bars slowly filling on the tablet screen. Buying debt is the purest form of invisible power. You do not need to threaten someone physically. You do not need to shout, argue, or raise your voice. You simply purchase the very ground they stand on and wait patiently for them to realize they are hopelessly trapped inside your custom-built cage. Patricia had kicked me out into the freezing storm because she firmly believed I was a useless, penniless ghost. She believed she had successfully stolen my brother's lifelong home, his critical medical funds, and his entire future. She was actively planning to sell the property to commercial developers and live the rest of her life in luxury. She had no idea that the commercial developers could never legally buy the house without clearing the financial liens first. She had no idea that I now personally owned every lien attached to her name. The tablet screen flashed a brilliant green. A secure digital receipt materialized on the high-resolution display. The Delaware Shell Company had enthusiastically accepted the cash transfer. L&L Holdings owned the 3 primary mortgages on Patricia's house. Seconds later, a second notification pinged loudly in the quiet cabin. The underground betting syndicate had transferred Stephen's entire gambling debt to our corporate ledger. The transaction was, and irreversible. I handed the glowing tablet back to Winston. The luxurious warmth of the Bentley had chased away the freezing dampness of the storm outside. I was no longer a helpless victim trapped in a concrete basement, eating poisoned stew and waiting to be discarded. I was the supreme architect of their impending destruction. I told Winston to draft the formal default notices for the primary bank to deliver by certified mail on Monday morning. I wanted Patricia to wake up thinking she was a victorious millionaire, only to open her morning mail and discover she was bankrupt and facing immediate eviction. Monday morning began with a certified envelope hitting Patricia's front door. I was no longer inside the house to watch her open it. That was the point. 3 nights earlier, she had thrown me into freezing rain, believing she had removed the only person who could resist her. I was now sitting in Winston's Manhattan office, warm, dry, and watching the creditor file move across his secure case system. L&L Holdings had completed the mortgage assignments. The servicing company sent the notices required by the loan documents and state process. Patricia's newest balloon obligation was approaching maturity, and the other loans contained cross-default provisions that became relevant once the file was reviewed. The envelope was not a magical eviction. It was worse for her because it was real. It advised her that the debt had been transferred, that L&L Holdings was now the creditor, and that foreclosure remedies would begin unless the default was cured according to the loan terms. Winston's phone rang 12 minutes after delivery. The servicing team had already received Patricia's call. She demanded to know who had bought the loans. She insisted the old lender had promised flexibility. The representative gave her only the facts permitted by the file. The new creditor was L&L Holdings. The default remained unresolved. No informal extension had been approved. When Winston relayed her reaction, I pictured the color draining from her face. The servicing representative noted that Patricia had tried 3 different arguments in less than 5 minutes. First, she claimed the transfer was a clerical error. Then she insisted the old lender had promised her 10 extra days. Finally, she demanded the name and direct number of the person behind L&L Holdings. The representative gave her neither. The call ended with Patricia threatening litigation. Winston looked at me across the conference table. She thinks volume is leverage. It always worked on Lawrence. Not anymore. But I did not need to be in the hallway to enjoy it. A silent adjustment works best when the target cannot see the hand moving the pieces. The mortgage pressure was only the first strike. Stephen still had $30,000 of gambling debt hanging over him. He also believed his mother had refused to help because she had no money available. I knew better. The photographs from the hidden safe showed bundles of cash Patricia had withdrawn while Lawrence's medical fund was being drained. I prepared one page. No logo, no signature, no threat. Just a cropped image from Patricia's own ledger and a sentence printed beneath it. Your mother has cash under the floor of her study. She is letting you panic while she protects herself. Winston had a courier slip the envelope under Stephen's motel room door. Then we waited. The micro-recorder I had left beneath the dining table was still active. Winston had preserved its transmission channel after Patricia threw me out. It could not show me the study, but it could hear enough of the house to tell us when the second domino fell. 9 minutes after the courier confirmed delivery, the recorder picked up the front door slamming. Heavy footsteps crossed the foyer. A door crashed open. Then came a series of metallic blows. Winston looked up from his laptop. Study. I nodded. Another strike rang through the audio. Then another. Stephen had found the safe. The recorder did not capture every movement, but it captured the sound of the locking mechanism breaking and papers being thrown across the floor. A minute later, Patricia screamed. "What are you doing?" Stephen answered so loudly, the dining room microphone caught every word. "You had money the whole time." He accused her of hiding cash, while men were threatening him over the gambling debt. Patricia shouted that the money was needed to stop the foreclosure. Stephen told her he did not care about the house. She ordered him to put the cash back. He refused. The argument became uglier by the second. Patricia called him a parasite. Stephen called her a liar. She said she had spent years cleaning up his failures. He answered that she had funded Amanda's vacations while letting him beg. The family hierarchy was collapsing exactly where I expected it to collapse, at the point where money became scarce. That was the same fault line I had seen in corrupt companies for 40 years. Executives could pretend to be loyal while the cash flowed. Once liquidity disappeared, every secret alliance became a negotiation. Patricia had built this family the same way she built her finances. Everyone received just enough to remain dependent on her. Now, dependence had become panic. The microphone caught a chair, scraping a body hitting the desk, and Patricia yelling his name as he ran from the study. Stephen shouted that the cash was the only thing standing between him and a hospital bed. Patricia screamed that the money was for the mortgage and lawyers. He accused her of caring more about imported furniture and Amanda's trips than whether her own son survived the week. She called him a degenerate who had already cost the family enough. Then came a hard impact and a sharp gasp from Patricia. Stephen had clearly shoved past her. The front door slammed. Silence returned. Winston closed the audio window. We did not need a camera to understand what had happened. Stephen had chosen himself. Patricia had lost the emergency cash, and neither of them knew the same company now holding the mortgage file also controlled the debt pressure that had driven Stephen into the safe. I leaned back in the leather chair. For 46 years, Lawrence had absorbed each crisis so everyone else could remain comfortable. He sold the truck. He surrendered the bedroom. He gave up the medical money. He accepted blame. The moment he was removed from the system, the people who depended on his sacrifice began feeding on one another. Winston opened the next folder. The birthday event is still on. Patricia's 70th birthday. Despite the default notice, despite Stephen stealing her cash, despite Amanda and Jared circling their own loan scheme, she was still hosting the country club gala. She needed investors. She needed appearances. She needed the room to believe she was wealthy long enough for someone to rescue her. That made the party useful. The invitation list Winston obtained through the country club showed exactly what Patricia intended. Local developers, private investors, 2 commercial brokers, People who might believe a polished story long enough to hand her another line of credit. She planned to use status to outrun arithmetic. I planned to put arithmetic in a tailored suit and let it walk directly toward her. I told Winston to confirm L&L Holdings' attendance, not as Lawrence, not as the frightened husband she had thrown into the rain. As chairman, the creditor she had never met, Winston smiled for the first time all morning. Before we closed the file, he reminded me that buying the mortgages did not make me owner of the house. L&L Holdings held the debt and the remedies attached to it. Foreclosure still required the proper process. I wanted that distinction preserved. Patricia had spent years confusing control with ownership. I was not going to win by making the same mistake. He understood. The foreclosure notice had frightened her. Stephen's theft had wounded her. Now I was going to stand in front of her carrying the only financial power she thought might save her. And she was going to invite me closer herself. The grand ballroom of the Oak Ridge Country Club was dripping with crystal chandeliers and overflowing with imported white roses. Patricia had spared no expense for her 70th birthday celebration. She was bankrupt, her home was facing imminent foreclosure, and her entire family was internally fracturing, yet she chose to throw a lavish gala. Arrogant people believe that if they construct a shiny enough facade, reality will simply refuse to tear it down. She had invited dozens of local socialites, and more importantly, several wealthy private investors. She was hoping to secure an influx of fresh capital by selling them a fabricated story of a lucrative real estate venture. She was trying to build a new scam on top of a collapsing foundation. I sat in the back of Winston's armored vehicle parked outside the club. I looked at my reflection in the tinted glass. I was no longer the broken, shivering ghost who had been locked in a freezing basement. Winston had brought in a private barber and a master tailor. My shaggy, unkempt gray hair was trimmed and styled immaculately. The exhausted slump in my shoulders was gone, replaced by the rigid, commanding posture I had utilized for decades in corporate boardrooms. I wore a custom-tailored midnight black suit woven from fine Italian wool, paired with a crisp white shirt and a solid silk tie. When you change your posture, your grooming, and your entire energetic aura, you do not just look like a different person. You become unrecognizable to people who only ever saw you as a victim. Winston sat beside me in an equally gray suit, checking his secure tablet one final time. He confirmed that Patricia was inside courting a prominent commercial developer. She was trying to pitch a joint venture using the very house whose mortgage debt L&L Holdings now controlled. I adjusted my silk tie, opened the armored door, and stepped out into the crisp evening air. We walked past the valet attendants, who stood straighter, recognizing the quiet, undeniable authority of extreme wealth. We entered the crowded ballroom. A live jazz quartet played softly in the corner. Waiters in crisp white uniforms circulated with trays of vintage champagne. I scanned the room and instantly spotted Patricia. She was wearing a floor-length emerald gown that clung tightly to her frame, her neck with diamonds she had likely purchased using my brother's stolen medical funds. She was standing near the center ice sculpture, laughing loudly and lightly, touching the arm of an older, wealthy-looking gentleman. Winston and I approached the group, slowly commanding the space without rushing a step. As we drew closer, Patricia turned her head. Her eyes swept over me. I braced myself for the scream of recognition, for the panic to set in. But nothing happened. Her eyes simply widened slightly, taking in the bespoke suit, the polished leather shoes, and the confidence radiating from my posture. She did not see Lawrence, the miserable husband she had thrown into the freezing rain just days ago. She saw a wealthy, powerful stranger. She saw fresh prey. Winston stepped forward smoothly, extending a hand to Patricia. He introduced himself as legal counsel for L&L Holdings, the private investment firm that had recently acquired significant assets in her local district. He then turned and introduced me simply as the chairman of the board. The moment the words "and L Holdings" left Winston's mouth, the color drained from Patricia's face. This was the name of the shadow corporation that had bought out her mortgages and sent her the devastating foreclosure notice. Panic flashed in her eyes, but her survival instinct quickly buried it under a thick layer of desperate charm. She forced a radiant artificial smile and stepped toward me, extending her manicured hand. She told me it was an honor to finally meet the man behind the company. Her voice was dripping with a sickeningly sweet tone that made my stomach turn. She practically shoved the other commercial developer aside, focusing her entire predatory gaze on me. She did not recognize the face of the man she had tortured for decades, because she had never actually looked at Lawrence. She had only ever looked at what he could provide. Now blinded by the scent of corporate wealth, her brain refused to connect the imposing executive standing before her with the broken old man she thought she had successfully discarded. I took her hand briefly. My grip was firm and cold. I told her she threw a truly magnificent party. I kept my voice low, smoothing out the rural cadence my brother used, and replacing it with the clipped, precise articulation of a Manhattan financier. I remarked that it was quite an extravagant celebration for someone facing such complex real estate transitions. Patricia let out a high-pitched, nervous laugh. She waved her hand dismissively, signaling a nearby waiter to bring me a fresh glass of champagne. She personally took the crystal flute from the silver tray and handed it to me with a slight, subservient bow. She looked up at me through her eyelashes, unaware that she was eagerly serving the very husband she despised. She leaned in close, the smell of her expensive perfume almost. She lowered her voice conspiratorially. She told me the foreclosure notice was just a misunderstanding with her previous bank. She claimed her finances were robust, but her husband had recently fallen severely ill with a tragic neurological condition. She sighed dramatically, placing a hand over her heart. She lied to my face, spinning a tragic tale of how her husband's sudden dementia had caused terrible administrative errors and how she was handedly trying to save their estate from his mental mistakes. She looked at me with wide, pleading eyes, asking for a private meeting to discuss restructuring the debt. I took a slow sip of the champagne. I watched her practically beg for her financial life. She was pathetic, a parasite disconnected from its host, trying to latch on to the closest source of power. I let the silence stretch, forcing her to squirm under my steady, unblinking gaze. I finally lowered my glass and offered her a thin, calculating smile. I told her I deeply admired a woman who took such decisive control of her family's future during a medical crisis. I told her that L&L Holdings was always willing to negotiate with motivated property owners, provided they were willing to secure the debt with undeniable collateral. Patricia's eyes lit up with wild, greedy hope. She clasped her hands together, thanking me profusely. She promised she had all the necessary legal documentation, proving she had full, uncontested authority over the estate. She was, of course, referring to the fraudulent power of attorney she had forced me to sign with the evaporating ink. She eagerly asked when we could sit down and formalize a new arrangement. I told her I was a very busy man, but I would make an exception for someone in her unique position. I instructed her to bring her son Stephen to my private suite at the hotel tomorrow evening. I explicitly stated that we would draft a brand new contract, one that would permanently resolve all of her debts and secure her future once and for all. The oak doors of the penthouse suite at the Grand Imperial Hotel swung open precisely at 8 o'clock the following evening. Winston stood by the marble foyer, his posture immaculate, holding the door for our guests. Patricia stepped into the room wearing a tailored navy suit and clutching a designer leather briefcase tightly against her chest. Right behind her walked Stephen. He looked out of place in a cheap, poorly fitting blazer, his eyes darting nervously around the opulent suite. I was sweating profusely, likely terrified that the underground bookies were still hunting him. He had no idea that I already owned his life. I sat in a high-backed leather armchair, near the roaring fireplace, swirling a glass of sparkling water. I gestured to the long mahogany dining table in the center of the room. I told them to take a seat and make themselves comfortable. Patricia forced a radiant, artificial smile. She walked forward with exaggerated confidence, trying to project the image of a seasoned real estate investor rather than a bankrupt woman drowning in fraudulent debt. Stephen slumped into the chair beside her, bouncing his leg anxiously under the table. Patricia did not waste any time. Arrogant people rarely do when they believe they have the upper hand. She placed her leather briefcase on the polished mahogany and snapped the brass locks open. She told me she was grateful for this private meeting. She spun the same web of lies she had rehearsed at the country club the night before. She spoke of her husband's tragic and sudden cognitive decline, wiping an imaginary tear from her eye. She claimed the impending foreclosure was an administrative error caused by his failing memory. She told me she was stepping up to save her family's legacy and needed a consolidated loan extension to protect their assets. I kept my expression neutral. I took a slow sip of my water, letting the silence stretch until Stephen stopped bouncing his leg and held his breath. I told Patricia that my investment firm L&L Holdings was not in the business of handing out charity. I explained that we strictly required ironclad, undeniable collateral for any debt restructuring, especially for a portfolio as deeply compromised as hers. I looked at Stephen and added that we were also aware of a certain $30,000 unsecured gambling debt attached to her son, which our firm had recently acquired. Stephen turned the color of dirty chalk. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. Patricia shot him a look of venom, silently cursing him for jeopardizing her grand negotiation. But she quickly recovered, turning her predatory smile back to me. She slid a thick manila envelope across the mahogany table. She proudly announced that she possessed legally binding collateral. She told me the envelope contained a full, irrevocable power of attorney, signed by her husband just days ago in the presence of a licensed medical professional and a public notary. She boasted that the document granted her unchallenged authority to liquidate his entire estate, transfer all his medical trust funds, and use his assets to secure any commercial loans she deemed necessary. Winston stepped forward smoothly. He picked up the envelope and carefully pulled out the thick stack of legal papers. He laid them flat on the table, right under the bright glow of the crystal chandelier. I looked down at the signature line. The dark blue ink from the unstable chemical fountain pen I had used to forge my brother's signature was already fading. It had turned into a faint pale shadow of its former self, barely visible against the white paper. The chemical compound was evaporating into the air as Winston had promised. Patricia had been so consumed by her own greed that she had not bothered to inspect the documents since she snatched them from my hands in the living room. I looked back at Patricia and offered a warm, calculating smile. I told her the collateral appeared to be what we needed to move forward. I told her that L&L Holdings was prepared to consolidate all of her outstanding mortgages, fully absorb her son's illicit gambling markers, and grant them a 6-month grace period to stabilize their finances. Patricia let out a loud, breathless gasp of relief. Stephen actually slumped forward on the table, burying his face in his hands, as the weight of his criminal debts temporarily lifted from his shoulders. They thought they had just won the lottery. They thought they had successfully outsmarted a multi-million-dollar corporate entity using stolen assets. But there was one final condition. I said, my voice dropping to a low, serious register. Winston opened his own leather portfolio and slid a crisp legal document across the table toward them. I explained that the master note was a high-risk consolidation agreement, binding Patricia and Stephen as personal guarantors. The bold clause required them to represent that the collateral they submitted was genuine, valid, and lawfully obtained. If that representation proved false, the grace period ended, the debt accelerated, and L&L Holdings could pursue the pledged collateral and other remedies allowed by the agreement and the court. I also told them that knowingly using false collateral to obtain financial relief could be referred to investigators as evidence of fraud. The contract itself could not create a conviction or sentence. Their knowledge, their representations, and the surrounding evidence would determine what happened legally next. I leaned forward, locking eyes with Patricia. I asked her if she was certain her collateral was authentic. I gave her one final chance to walk away. Patricia did not even hesitate. Greed has a remarkable way of blinding people to the gallows being built right in front of them. She let out a dismissive laugh, stating confidently that her lawyer had personally overseen the signing. She grabbed the gold-plated pen Winston offered her and signed her name with aggressive, triumphant strokes across the bottom of the master agreement. She shoved the paper toward Stephen, commanding him to sign it as well to clear his pathetic gambling markers. Stephen practically tore the pen from her hand, scribbling his signature with frantic desperation. They pushed the signed contract back across the mahogany table. Patricia sat back in her chair, radiating an aura of sickening arrogance. She truly believed she had just saved her luxurious lifestyle by mortgaging the life of the husband she had thrown out into the freezing rain. She thanked me profusely, calling me a true gentleman and a savior to her family. I nodded slowly. I told her it was my pleasure to finally give her family what they deserved. Winston escorted them to the door. Patricia and Stephen walked out of the penthouse suite with their heads held high, intoxicated by their imaginary victory. The oak doors clicked shut behind them, sealing the quiet luxury of the room once again. Winston walked back to the dining table. He picked up the fraudulent power of attorney Patricia had proudly offered as her ultimate collateral. He held the pages up to the light of the chandelier. The faint, pale shadow of the blue ink was gone. The lines where my brother's forged signature had been were now blank. The paper was pristine. It was as if a pen had never touched it. I picked up the new master promissory note, bearing Patricia's and Stephen's fresh signatures. They had voluntarily guaranteed the authenticity of collateral, whose signature was disappearing in front of them. If they knew the authority was invalid, this note gave investigators a direct financial representation to compare with the video of the coerced signing. The civil default was now immediate. The criminal consequences, if any, would belong to investigators, prosecutors, and a court. Before dawn, Winston's litigation team filed the emergency application. They did not call a friendly judge at home. They did not ask a bank to freeze accounts because we were angry. They filed sworn evidence, the mortgage assignments, the photographs of Patricia's hidden records, the video of the competency evaluator taking cash, the recording connected to the sedative scheme, the coerced power of attorney signing, the new promissory note in which Patricia and Stephen guaranteed the authenticity of that authority. The emergency filing was assigned through the ordinary court system. Winston's team asked only for temporary relief tied to specific accounts, loan proceeds, and records identified in the evidence. They did not ask to seize every asset the family owned. A judge issued a temporary preservation order covering the accounts and commercial loan proceeds directly tied to the disputed transactions. The order did not decide guilt. It prevented money from disappearing while the court and investigators examined the evidence. The order also required the financial institutions to preserve transaction logs and notify the appropriate parties if someone attempted a transfer inconsistent with the restriction. That detail mattered more to me than any dramatic freeze. Records survive panic. That was all we needed. Amanda and Jared did not know any of it. The recorder beneath the dining table came alive shortly after 6. Jared had found a copy of Patricia's new L&L agreement. He read the acceleration clause aloud. Amanda panicked. Their plan depended on moving the remaining business loan proceeds before Patricia's financial collapse reached the account. Jared made the decision for both of them. They would go to the bank as soon as it opened, transfer the money, drive out of state, leave Patricia with the debt. I listened from Winston's office until the front door closed behind them. Then I removed the earbud. "They're moving." Winston nodded. The preservation order had already been served on the bank. At 9:14, the institution's fraud liaison notified Winston's team that someone had presented a transfer request against one of the restricted accounts. We did not have a live camera inside the branch. We did not need one. The bank's own records would capture the transaction attempt. Jared requested $450,000 be wired to an out-of-state corporate account. The paperwork identified the receiving entity as a business affiliate, But the account history Winston had already reviewed showed the entity had no ordinary operating relationship with the original loan purpose. Amanda stood beside him with her handbag clutched against her chest. The teller entered the request. The system blocked it. A manager joined the conversation and informed Jared that the funds were subject to a court restriction and could not be transferred. According to the bank's incident report later provided through proper process, Jared became loud. Amanda demanded an explanation. They insisted the money belonged to their company. The manager asked them to wait while the legal department confirmed the order. Jared demanded the name of the judge. Amanda insisted the bank was destroying their business. The manager refused to debate the merits of the order at the counter. He simply repeated that the funds could not move. Jared tried to leave with the transfer paperwork. That was when bank security intervened. The police arrived minutes later because the bank had already been instructed to notify the Financial Crimes Unit if anyone attempted to move the preserved funds. The officers arrived because the attempted transfer matched the conduct described in the preservation notice, and because the bank wanted the event documented before anyone altered the account instructions. They did not arrive to deliver an instant conviction. They separated Jared and Amanda. They took statements. They copied the transfer request. They asked who controlled the receiving company and why the money was being moved while the source account was under restriction. Jared's confidence collapsed. Amanda called Patricia. The call hit the recorder still hidden under the dining table. "Mom, what did you do?" Patricia had just woken up. "What are you talking about?" "The bank won't release the money. Police are here." Patricia's voice sharpened. "Why are you moving my money?" Jared grabbed the phone. He shouted that the account was frozen and demanded she contact her lawyer. Patricia accused him of trying to steal from her. He accused her of destroying the business. The family began fighting before the police finished asking questions. That was the pattern now. Every crisis produced another betrayal. The bank did not let Jared complete the transfer. That failure mattered financially before it mattered criminally. Jared and Amanda had expected to convert borrowed money into a clean escape route. Instead, the attempted wire had become another dated record inside a file already full of suspicious transactions. Winston preserved the bank's notice and instructed his team not to contact Jared directly. "I did not want anyone provoking him into another act." The most useful evidence was the conduct he chose without our help. The police did not need to keep him in jail to make the point. After questioning and documentation, Jared and Amanda were released while the financial investigation continued. The officers made clear that release was not clearance. The transfer request account records and their statements would be reviewed with the broader file. They left the branch with no money and a transaction record that now showed exactly what they had tried to do. That detail mattered for the next morning. Jared was still free to walk into Winston's office, and he would. By noon, Patricia had learned that the court order touched the accounts she used for daily spending. The mortgage file was under pressure. Stephen's debt was controlled by L&L Holdings. Amanda and Jared's business money could not move. The cash in the safe was gone. Every exit she expected to use had closed. Her response was not remorse. It was rage. The recorder caught drawers opening and doors slamming at the house. She called the servicer again. She called the lawyer connected to the power of attorney paperwork. She called Stephen and got no answer. Each failed call made her more certain that Lawrence had somehow betrayed her. Winston received 3 calls from lawyers connected to the various accounts before lunch. He answered none of them casually. Every response went through the record. I sat across from him and watched the case become larger than a family argument. That was when I understood the last private phase was over. Patricia would not respond to documents by becoming reasonable. She would respond the way she always had, by looking for Lawrence, by trying to force the weakest person in the family to absorb the consequence. I picked up Lawrence's old phone. It had remained powered off since the motel. When I turned it on, the screen filled with missed calls and messages from Patricia. "Where are you? Call me. You caused this. Come home now." I ignored everyone. Then I typed the message from the outline we had prepared for the final confrontation. "Be at Attorney Winston's office at 8 tomorrow morning. Bring everyone who has lived as a parasite on my life." I pressed send. No threat, no explanation, just an address and a time. Winston looked at me. "Now they know where to go. Good." The message was not an invitation to negotiate. It was a funnel. For years, Patricia had summoned Lawrence with commands. This was the first time his phone gave her a command in return. I knew that alone would infuriate her enough to guarantee she came. Patricia had spent 46 years controlling the room. Tomorrow, she would enter one she did not control. The difference was important. I was not going to overpower Patricia by becoming louder than she was. I was going to place the facts in front of her and remove every place she normally hid. Patricia received the message while standing in the middle of a house that no longer felt like hers. She crossed the hallway and tore open the utility room door. The cot was empty. The frayed jacket was gone. The blanket was folded. Lawrence had vanished. She checked the basement, the garage, and the narrow side yard. She called his name with the same tone she normally used when ordering him to carry bags or surrender a password. No answer came back. That frightened her more than the foreclosure notice. For decades, she had relied on one certainty: no matter how badly she treated him, he stayed. Now he had left on the same morning her money stopped moving. She convinced herself the two events had to be connected. By evening, anger had replaced fear. Her social circle had also begun to disappear. 2 women from the country club declined her calls. A developer who had attended the birthday party suddenly had no time for a follow-up meeting. Patricia interpreted every silence as another betrayal. She needed one person she could still blame without consequence. Lawrence. She called Stephen first. I was hiding at a cheap motel, still terrified by the gambling debt, and furious that L&L Holdings controlled it. Patricia told him Lawrence had money hidden at Winston's office, and promised that if he helped force his father to cooperate, she would solve the debt problem. Stephen believed what desperation wanted him to believe. Amanda was next. She and Jared had spent hours answering questions after the failed bank transfer. Neither had been charged at the branch, but both knew the transaction was now part of a financial investigation. Patricia told them Lawrence had orchestrated the freeze. Jared said that made no sense. He had seen Lawrence shuffle through the house, sleep in a utility room, and accept humiliation without fighting back. The idea that the same man had arranged a creditor takeover and court order sounded absurd. Patricia answered with certainty instead of evidence. "He has Winston." That explanation was enough for Amanda. Amanda did not care whether it made sense. She wanted the money released. Patricia ordered both of them to come. By midnight, the family had built a new version of the same old story. Lawrence was confused. Lawrence was vindictive. Lawrence had somehow sabotaged the accounts. Lawrence could fix everything if they frightened him enough. Not one of them asked why a supposedly helpless 74-year-old man would suddenly have the power to move creditors, banks, and lawyers. They did not compare timelines. They did not examine the documents. They did not question why L&L Holdings had appeared only after Lawrence vanished. They simply agreed on the explanation that protected their pride. Arrogance supplied the answer. They still believed he did not. They believed Winston did, so they planned to use Lawrence as leverage against the lawyer. I spent that night in Winston's office with my brother. When Lawrence arrived from the cabin, he paused in the doorway before walking toward me. The last time I had seen him in person, he had been shivering on a motel balcony with pills in his hand. Now he was rested, clean-shaven, and eating without having to ask permission. The change was physical, but the important part was quieter. I was beginning to make decisions without apologizing for them. Lawrence had been sleeping safely for days. Warm food had returned color to his face. The shaking in his hands had eased. A tailor adjusted a charcoal suit to fit him properly, and for the first time in years, he looked like the man I remembered from before Patricia made submission a daily habit. We sat together near the conference room window. He asked me whether switching places had been worth the risk. I told him I had needed to see the abuse with my own eyes. Bank records could prove theft. Cameras could prove bribery. But only living inside that house had shown me how every member of the family had learned to treat his surrender as normal. Lawrence looked down at his hands. I taught them I would always give in. You survived the only way you knew how. Tomorrow I stop. That answer was enough. He asked how much of the evidence they would see. Enough. He asked whether Patricia would recognize me before she saw him. Maybe. He gave a small, tired smile. She hasn't looked at me in years. That was the real reason the country club disguise had worked. Patricia recognized status faster than she recognized faces. At 7:30 the next morning, Winston reviewed the room. Nothing about the setup looked theatrical. No spotlight, no hidden stage. Just a long table, neutral walls, a screen for the evidence and documents placed in order. The power of the room came from preparation. The documents were arranged in sequence. The blanking power of attorney, the medical report, the video file, the audio file, the debt assignments, the court preservation order. Two plainclothes officers from the Financial Crimes Unit waited nearby because investigators had already been reviewing the evidence Winston submitted. They were there for safety and to deal with any conduct that occurred in their presence, not to serve as my private muscle. At 8, the elevator opened. Patricia stepped out first. Stephen followed with his fists clenched. Amanda and Jared came behind him, still arguing in whispers about the bank. 4 people. Exactly the group this message had drawn. Patricia wore dark glasses despite the gray morning. Stephen looked as if he had not slept. Amanda held her phone in one hand and kept checking the screen for bank alerts. Jared carried a folder from the failed transfer, already prepared to argue that his business was the true victim. Natalie was not with them. She had called Stephen repeatedly overnight, but he had refused to tell her where he was going. That would matter later. Patricia marched to reception and demanded Lawrence. She threatened to sue the firm. Stephen threatened to drag his father out if anyone tried to stop him. Amanda demanded the account restrictions be removed. Jared wanted someone to explain whether his business funds were permanently lost. The receptionist let them speak. Then she opened the conference room doors. Patricia entered as if she owned the place. The others followed. Winston asked them to sit. They refused. The doors remained unlocked. That detail was deliberate. No one was being detained. They were free to leave. But Patricia had not come to leave. She had come to dominate Lawrence one more time. I waited in the hallway. Lawrence waited in the adjacent executive room. Through the monitor, we watched Patricia pace beside the table and rehearse the threats she had used for decades: commitment, financial control, public humiliation. She believed the old words would still work. Lawrence watched without shrinking. His shoulders stayed level. At one point, Stephen slammed his palm against the table. My brother did not flinch. That was when I knew he was ready. I stood. Winston gave me a nod. The final confrontation did not need another financial trick. That mattered to me. Every earlier move had been designed to make the family reveal itself. Now the record was complete. If I added another deception merely for drama, I would be doing what they had done all their lives, confusing control with truth. The accounts were preserved. The debts were controlled. The evidence existed. The only thing left was truth. I placed my hand on the conference room door. Inside, Patricia shouted Lawrence's name. I opened it. The room went quiet when I entered. A few seconds earlier, Patricia had been shouting across Winston's conference table, demanding access to Lawrence and threatening everyone who refused her. Stephen had been pacing near the windows. Amanda and Jared were arguing about the frozen business funds. Then the door opened. All four of them turned toward me. Patricia turned first. For half a second, she looked confused by the suit, the posture, and the face she had seen at her birthday gala. At the country club, Patricia had stood close enough to hand me champagne. She had smiled at me, praised my supposed financial judgment, and asked for mercy from L&L Holdings. Now that same face was entering Winston's office at the exact moment she expected to bully her husband. Her mind noticed the contradiction before her ego allowed her to understand it. Then habit took over. "Where have you been?" She pointed at me as if I were still the husband she had ordered into a basement. "You are going to fix the accounts. You are going to tell this lawyer the bank made a mistake, and you are going to sign whatever they put in front of you." Stephen moved behind her. Amanda crossed her arms. Jared demanded that the business funds be released. They spoke over one another until the conference room sounded like the dining room I had listened to through the recorder. Stephen wanted his gambling debt released. Amanda wanted the bank restriction removed. Jared wanted his commercial funds restored. Patricia wanted all three things fixed by the man she still believed was Lawrence. No one asked whether he was safe. No one asked where he had slept after being thrown into the rain. They went straight to money. I did not answer immediately. Patricia stepped closer. "If you fight me again, I will have you committed permanently." I let the sentence hang. Then I spoke in my own voice. "You are threatening the wrong man." The difference stopped her. My voice was not louder than Lawrence's. It was simply unused to asking permission. Years of boardrooms had taught me to finish a sentence without shrinking at the end of it. Patricia heard that difference before she understood why it frightened her. Lawrence and I had the same basic voice, but 46 years of submission had changed the way my brother used his. His speech had become softer, smaller, apologetic. Mine had not. Patricia stared at me. Stephen stopped moving. Amanda's face tightened. Jared looked toward Winston, waiting for an explanation. I gave them none. The door to the adjacent executive room opened. Lawrence stepped out. He wore a charcoal suit. His hair had been trimmed. His shoulders were straight. He walked to my side and stopped. Two identical faces. Two men of the same age. One wearing midnight black. One charcoal gray. Lawrence took one more step until our shoulders nearly aligned. The resemblance was exact enough that Amanda covered her mouth. Stephen stared at the two of us as if the room had split down the middle. The family had spent years. Lawrence's posture was part of his identity. Now they saw the same face carrying two entirely different lives. Patricia's mouth opened. No sound came out. Her eyes moved from me to Lawrence and back again. Stephen grabbed the back of a chair. Amanda whispered, "No." Jared simply stared. I watched the realization build in Patricia's face. The cold water, the basement, the moldy bread, the false password, the broken camera, the drugged meal, the competency evaluation, the power of attorney, the man at the country club, L&L Holdings. Patricia's eyes moved over me as if each memory were being replayed with a different label beneath it. The person she thought she had controlled had been observing her. The husband she thought she had erased had been somewhere else recovering. She had believed every event was separate because she believed Lawrence incapable of creating a strategy. Now the pieces connected. "You," she said. I nodded. She looked at Lawrence, then at me. Her face lost color. The man she had humiliated after curfew had not been her husband. The man Stephen had grabbed by the collar had not been his father. The man Amanda and Jared banished to a storage room had not been the victim they thought they understood. They had performed their cruelty in front of a witness trained to follow money. Patricia backed toward the table. "This is fraud." Winston finally spoke. No. This is a family meeting in my office. The documents will speak for themselves. She pointed at me. He impersonated my husband. The accusation was not entirely wrong. I had stepped into Lawrence's clothes and allowed Patricia to believe I was him. I had done it because the alternative was leaving my brother alone on a motel balcony with a bottle of pills. I was not going to pretend the switch carried no risk. I was also not going to let Patricia use that risk to erase what happened inside the house. I did not argue with the word. I told her I had stepped into Lawrence's place because he was standing on a motel balcony with pills in his hand after 46 years of her control. That sentence reached the room differently. For the first time, Amanda looked at Lawrence rather than at the financial papers. Jared's expression changed. Stephen's jaw tightened. Patricia did not soften. She treated Lawrence's near suicide as an accusation against her rather than a crisis that should have stopped everything. Amanda looked at her father. Stephen looked away. Patricia recovered first. Predators rarely accept a new reality without testing whether the old weapon still works. She straightened. I have medical proof Lawrence is incompetent. Winston placed a folder on the table. I also have his power of attorney. Another folder. I have legal control of the house. A third. Each claim gave us the next piece of evidence, exactly as planned. Lawrence stood beside me without speaking. Patricia turned toward him. You come home with me now. He did not move. She said his name, the old command, the old tone. Nothing. For the first time in their marriage, silence belonged to Lawrence instead of Patricia. I was not using it to disappear. He was using it to refuse. That distinction was visible in the way he stood. His hands were relaxed. His shoulders remained straight. Patricia repeated his name, but the old reflex never returned. Stephen stepped forward. Dad, stop this. We need the accounts reopened. Lawrence looked at him. There was no fear in his face, only exhaustion. Amanda began explaining that Jared's business had employees and obligations, as if the failed transfer were an administrative inconvenience rather than an attempt to move restricted money. Jared told Winston the court order was destroying an innocent company. Winston asked whether he wanted to put that statement in writing. Jared stopped talking. Patricia's control was slipping by the second. She struck the table with her palm. I have documents. Winston opened the first folder. Then let's review them. That was the moment the meeting changed shape. Until then, Patricia still believed she could restore the old hierarchy by raising her voice. Once Winston began opening the folders, the argument stopped being about who could dominate the room. It became about dates, signatures, recordings, and money trails. Not because anyone locked the door. Not because officers moved. Because Patricia finally understood that every weapon she intended to use against Lawrence was already sitting on Winston's table. And the first one was about to disappear in her hands. Patricia stood frozen in the center of the conference room, her manicured hands gripping the edge of the mahogany table. Her mind was trying to reject the impossible reality standing right in front of her. She looked at me dressed in my bespoke midnight black suit and then shifted her terrified gaze to my twin brother Lawrence, standing tall and dignified in his tailored charcoal gray suit. The certainty of her wealthy future had just been shattered, but the arrogance of a lifelong predator does not simply evaporate. When cornered, a true narcissist does not apologize. They double down. They cling to whatever scraps of power they believe they still possess. The initial shock began to fade from Patricia's face, replaced by a desperate, venomous fury. She slammed her hands flat against the polished wood and leaned forward. She refused to accept that she had been outplayed by a man she considered beneath her. She pointed a shaking finger at my chest and let out a harsh, bitter laugh that echoed off the glass walls. You think this little theatrical performance changes anything? She yelled, her voice shrill and echoing with panic. You think you can just dress him up in a cheap suit and undo the law? I hold the legal authority over this entire family. I have the signed medical certificate from a licensed psychiatrist, proving that he is severely mentally incompetent. And more importantly, I have the fully executed power of attorney. You are nothing but a trespasser. I legally own the house. I legally own the bank accounts. I own his entire miserable life. She turned to Winston, demanding he call the building security to have me physically removed. She shouted that she was the victim of a coordinated harassment campaign and threatened to sue the entire law firm for facilitating fraud. She was grasping at invisible straws, fully convinced her fraudulent paperwork was an impenetrable shield. Winston did not call security. He simply reached into his pristine leather briefcase and pulled out a crisp piece of white paper. He placed it delicately on the center of the mahogany table under the bright glare of the overhead chandelier. I took a slow, deliberate step forward. I kept my voice calm, allowing the deep, resonant baritone to fill the quiet room. I told Patricia to look very closely at her ultimate weapon. I suggested she examine the undeniable legal authority she was so proud of. Patricia snatched the paper from the table, her eyes darting to the bottom of the page. It was the irrevocable power of attorney document she had forced me to sign in her living room just days prior. She looked at the signature lines. She blinked hard, shaking her head in confusion. She turned the paper over, searching the back of the page. The paper was blank. The dark blue ink from the unstable chemical fountain pen Winston had provided was gone. It had evaporated into thin air, leaving no trace, no indentation, and no legal standing whatsoever. Patricia stared at the blank page, mouth opening and closing, without producing a sound. Her hands began to tremble so the thick paper rattled in her grip. I looked down at her and delivered the undeniable reality of her situation. I explained that the blank page did not magically convict her of anything. The problem was the sequence surrounding it. Patricia had watched the document being signed, presented it as valid collateral to obtain a restructuring, and then signed a new financial agreement guaranteeing its authenticity. Combined with the video of the coerced signing and the fading ink record Winston preserved, that sequence could support a serious fraud investigation. Stephen's signature placed him beside the same representation. Neither of them could dismiss the discrepancy as a harmless clerical error. Stephen stumbled backward, his legs hitting the edge of a leather chair. He realized instantly that his own signature was right next to hers on that same master agreement. He had chained himself to her sinking ship just to clear his miserable gambling markers. Amanda let out a breathless gasp, covering her mouth in terror, as she realized her mother was facing decades in a federal penitentiary. Jared stood still, his arrogant smirk wiped from his face as the weight of the law descended upon the room. But Patricia was not finished fighting. Desperation makes people dangerous and reckless. She threw the blank paper onto the floor. She screamed that it did not matter what happened to the ink. She insisted she still possessed the certified medical evaluation. She shouted that Lawrence was genuinely suffering from advanced dementia, and she had only taken these extreme measures to protect the family from his failing mind. She claimed she was a dedicated, loving wife who had been pushed to her breaking point. Winston did not argue with her. He simply picked up a small silver remote control from the table and pressed a button. The flat-screen television mounted on the far wall of the conference room flared to life. The high-definition video filled the screen, displaying the perspective from the micro camera hidden inside the top button of my faded flannel shirt. The footage showed Patricia's pristine living room. It showed the cheap, corrupt doctor sitting on the beige sofa. Patricia froze her eyes, locking onto the screen in horror. The room listened in dead silence as the audio track played the sound of the doctor declaring Lawrence mentally incompetent, without asking a valid medical question. The video clearly showed Patricia walking into the frame, holding the thick, unmarked manila envelope. The high-resolution lens captured her handing over the stack of cash. The audio blasted the doctor's arrogant voice, confirming the $5,000 bribe, guaranteeing her that she now possessed the legal authority to erase her husband from existence. Winston pressed the button again. The screen transitioned to a secondary audio file. It was the recording from the micro device I had planted under their dining room table. Patricia's own frantic voice echoed through the executive boardroom. The recording captured her desperate morning phone call to the corrupt veterinarian, explicitly demanding a refill of the illegal livestock sedatives she had been secretly hiding in her husband's food. She was actively plotting to medically induce a state of artificial dementia. She was systematically attempting to poison the man she had sworn to love and protect. Patricia collapsed into one of the leather chairs. The remaining blood drained from her face. Her breathing became shallow and rapid. She looked at the giant screen and then looked back at me, her eyes wide with the hollow, vacant stare of a predator that had finally been caught in a steel trap. She could not formulate an excuse. There were no more lies to spin. The pristine curtain had been ripped away, exposing the rotting, decaying monster hiding underneath. The silence in the room was, and it was finally broken by a voice that had not spoken with any true authority in nearly half a century. Lawrence stepped forward from the shadows of the room. He did not shuffle. He did not look at the floor. He walked with the quiet, powerful dignity of a man who had finally reclaimed his own soul. He stood in front of Patricia, forcing her to look up into the eyes of the husband she had treated worse than a stray animal. For 46 years, I swallowed every insult, every humiliation, and every piece of cruelty you threw at me, Lawrence said, his voice remarkably steady and calm. I let you break me down piece by piece because I foolishly believed that my suffering was the necessary price to keep this family united. I yielded every day of my life, hoping that somewhere deep inside you, there was a shred of human decency. Patricia looked away, unable to maintain eye contact with the man she had tried to destroy. She stared at her shaking hands, powerless. But you do not know what love is, Lawrence continued, his tone carrying a sadness mixed with finality. You only know how to consume. I burned myself alive to keep you warm, and you simply complained about the ash. You wanted to own everything, Patricia. You wanted control. But in your endless, blinding greed, you burned this entire family to the ground all by yourself. But Stephen did not cry. Stephen did not reflect on his own failures. The degenerate gambler looked at the blank power of attorney document on the floor and then looked at the corporate television screen. He realized that the emergency cash was gone. He realized that the corporate bailout was a complete illusion. He remembered the underground bookies who were hunting him through the city streets, preparing to break his legs because he had failed to produce the $30,000. Panic fractured his mind. He let out a vicious, primal scream of desperation. He lunged across the wide mahogany table, his hands curled into fists, aiming for my brother's throat. He was willing to commit physical violence against his own father, just to vent his helpless terror. He never even made it halfway across the polished wood. The two men in business suits, who had been standing silently near the corners of the conference room, moved with explosive tactical speed. They were not private security guards. They were plainclothes officers from the Financial Crimes Division, who were present because investigators were already reviewing Winston's evidence, and the meeting carried an obvious risk of violence. The first officer grabbed Stephen by the collar of his cheap blazer, wanking his upper body backward and slamming him face first into the hard mahogany table. The impact rattled the crystal glasses. The second officer grabbed Stephen's flailing arms, pinning them forcefully behind his back. The unmistakable metallic click of steel handcuffs echoing loudly through the quiet room instantly paralyzed everyone else standing inside. Natalie entered the room slowly. Amanda was already crying. The two women looked at each other, then at Patricia. Their loyalty changed direction almost instantly. Amanda dropped into a chair and said her mother had controlled everything. She claimed Patricia directed the money and pressured everyone else to cooperate. Natalie said she had stayed quiet because Patricia threatened to cut Stephen off and throw them out whenever they challenged her. Neither apology sounded like remorse. They sounded like survival. Amanda said she had only used Lawrence's medical money because Patricia told her the account was family money. Natalie claimed Patricia had trained everyone in the house to believe Lawrence would always absorb the loss. Each woman offered a version of events that made her own choices smaller. Winston took notes without interrupting. They sounded like survival. Lawrence recognized it too. He did not comfort them. He simply looked away. For 46 years, tears had been used to make him surrender boundaries. They no longer worked. Winston opened the final legal folder. The documents inside were not theatrical punishments. That mattered to me because Patricia had spent her life treating paperwork like a weapon that became true the moment she waved it hard enough. I wanted the final documents to be the opposite: boring, specific, and enforceable. They were the result of the debt assignments, the temporary court orders, and the foreclosure process already underway. L&L Holdings held the 3 mortgage obligations on the house. The default had not been cured. The court had preserved the accounts and assets tied to the disputed borrowing while the fraud evidence was reviewed. Vehicle interests pledged under the loan agreements were subject to repossession according to those contracts. The house would move into possession through the lawful foreclosure and court-supervised possession process. The possession order required a supervised inventory at the property. Its purpose was not to humiliate Patricia. It was to separate ordinary personal belongings from collateral disputed property and items that might be needed in the financial case. Patricia did not own an empire anymore. She owned claims defenses and whatever personal property the law allowed her to keep. Winston placed the possession notice in front of her. She had 1 hour under supervision to collect ordinary clothing, medication, identification, and personal effects from the house before control of the property transferred to the receiver. That was the same basic ending the outline demanded, but it did not require pretending L&L Holdings could simply confiscate every object in her life by declaration. Patricia read the first page. Her breathing shortened. "What about my accounts?" "The restricted funds remain preserved subject to court order," Winston said. "The debt and fraud proceedings will determine what is applied, released, or recovered. My cars, those tied to enforceable collateral agreements, are being handled under those agreements. My jewelry, personal property, is not automatically ours because you dislike the answer." For once, precision was more frightening than exaggeration. Patricia could argue with an insult. She could call a threat unfair. She could perform outrage in front of a family member. She could not shout a loan assignment out of existence. She could not scream away a court order. She could not make a receiver disappear by calling Lawrence weak. There was no loophole hidden inside a dramatic threat. There was a file, a judge, a creditor, a receiver, evidence. Patricia looked at me. "You did this." "No," I said. "I stopped absorbing it for you." She turned to Lawrence. "Tell him to stop." Lawrence's answer came without hesitation. "No." One word. 46 years late. Still powerful. Lawrence did not look at me for approval after he said it. That was the part I remembered later. He had spent decades checking Patricia's face before making even minor choices. This time he gave his answer and let it stand. Patricia's composure broke. The collapse was not elegant. She moved from pleading to accusation in seconds. She said the children had betrayed her. She said Winston had manipulated the court. She said I had stolen her family. Then she turned to Lawrence and tried the oldest argument of all. Everything she had done was necessary because he had been too weak to lead. She slid from the chair to the carpet, sobbing and shouting that everyone had betrayed her. She blamed Stephen, Amanda, Jared, Natalie, the bank, Winston, me. Finally, she blamed Lawrence for becoming weak enough to force her to manage everything. My brother listened without moving. That was the moment I knew the switch had worked. Not because Patricia was ruined, because Lawrence no longer believed her version of him. One of the plainclothes officers stepped forward. The financial crimes investigation had progressed beyond the bank transfer. Investigators had reviewed Winston's evidence before the meeting including the allegedly fraudulent mortgages, the bribed competency report, the sedative evidence, and the new representations to L&L Holdings. The officer told Patricia that investigators had obtained authority to take her into custody based on the evidence already reviewed before the meeting. The presentation in the conference room had not created the warrant in real time. It had simply put the same evidence in front of the family she had spent years controlling. The officer told Patricia she was being taken into custody on the warrants and complaints already authorized in that investigation. The exact final charges would be determined by prosecutors. The allegations included fraud-related offenses and conspiracy connected to the effort to drug and financially control Lawrence. Patricia screamed that the poisoning story was a lie. The officer did not debate her. He read her rights. The handcuffs closed around her wrists. She fought for several seconds, then stopped. Stephen watched from the other side of the room, already restrained after his attack. Amanda covered her face. Natalie stepped backward. Jared said nothing. I did not celebrate. Arrest was not a verdict. Foreclosure was not moral redemption. A frozen account did not give Lawrence back 46 years. Those systems could address money and conduct. They could not rebuild the man Patricia had spent decades reducing. That part came next. The officers escorted Patricia and Stephen out. Amanda, Jared, and Natalie were told where they would need to cooperate with investigators and the civil proceedings. None of them were handed instant forgiveness or instant convictions. They left the room quieter than they had entered it. The doors closed. No one applauded. Winston did not congratulate me. Lawrence did not smile at the sight of Patricia in handcuffs. The conference room finally became still. Winston gathered the evidence into his briefcase. I turned toward Lawrence. For the first time since the motel, there was no one in the room asking him for money. Signatures, passwords, obedience, or sacrifice. The parasite system was gone. What remained was my brother, and a life he had almost thrown away because he believed there was no exit. I walked toward the tea service. The final act was not punishment. It was giving him somewhere safe to go. The heavy mahogany doors of the conference room clicked shut, sealing out the frantic, echoing screams of the woman who had terrorized my brother for 46 years. The officers escorted Patricia toward the private freight elevator at the end of the long corridor. Her shrill voice bounced off the polished marble walls of the reception area, cursing my name, cursing the bank, and cursing the very children she had weaponized against her own husband. Her cries grew fainter and more desperate as the steel elevator doors slid closed, plunging the high-rise executive floor into a sudden, absolute silence. Stephen was already gone. He had been hauled away through the emergency stairwell in heavy iron chains. A degenerate gambler finally forced to pay a debt he could no longer manipulate his way out of. Amanda and Natalie had fled the building the exact moment the officers allowed them to leave. They scattered like frightened insects, exposed to a sudden blinding glare of sunlight. They were broke, disgraced, and completely severed from the host they had bled dry for their entire adult lives. The immediate threat was gone. The legal and financial cases would continue outside the room. I stood near the center of the expansive room, listening to the quiet, steady hum of the building system. Winston moved with his usual mechanical efficiency. He did not speak or offer any unnecessary congratulations. He quietly gathered the blank power of attorney document, the forged medical certificate, and the digital recording devices that had sealed the fate of the abusers. He placed them meticulously into his expensive leather briefcase, snapping the brass locks shut with a sharp final sound. He gave me a single respectful nod, understanding that his role in this corporate execution was entirely concluded. He walked out of the conference room, leaving my twin brother and me entirely alone in the aftermath of the slaughter. I turned to look at Lawrence. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling glass window, staring down at the sprawling, concrete grid of Manhattan. During the first week I spent in his freezing basement eating poisoned stew and wearing his frayed canvas jacket. I had felt the crushing, suffocating weight of his miserable existence. I had felt the absolute terror that dictated his every waking moment, the constant fear of a woman who viewed him as nothing more than a disposable asset. Now, looking at him bathed in the crisp morning sunlight, filtering through the expensive glass, the transformation was undeniable. He did not look like a victim anymore. He looked like a man who had just woken up from a half-century nightmare. I walked over to the sleek wooden credenza resting against the far wall of the boardroom. A polished silver tea service sat perfectly arranged on a dark slate tray. I picked up the heavy porcelain teapot. The hot liquid poured smoothly into two delicate china cups, the gentle sound filling the quiet space. In the ruthless world of international finance, men celebrate hostile takeovers with vintage champagne and imported cigars. They crave the loud, intoxicating validation of destroying their rivals and seizing their assets. But this was not a corporate acquisition. This was the meticulous removal of a deadly parasite from a dying host. It required no loud celebration. It only required the quiet dignity of survival. I picked up one of the warm china cups and walked over to the wide mahogany table. I set the cup down near the edge, watching the steam rise in a thin, elegant column. I reached into the inner pocket of my bespoke midnight black suit. My fingers brushed against a heavy ring of pristine brass keys. During the days I spent auditing Patricia's fraudulent mortgages and dismantling her criminal shell companies, I had instructed Winston's real estate division to secure a highly specific property. I pulled the keys from my pocket and placed them on the table right next to the steaming cup of tea. I told Lawrence to turn around. He slowly shifted his gaze from the bustling city streets far below and looked at me. I gestured toward the table. I explained that the keys belonged to a newly constructed cedar cabin located on the quiet shores of Lake Champlain, completely hidden by acres of dense pine forest. I told him the property was held through a privacy-protected trust that I had funded with proper recorded ownership. The title was clean, the property taxes were funded through the trust, and the address was kept out of casual family access. I explained that there was a large wooden workshop built into the back of the property, fully stocked with professional carpentry tools waiting for him to build the furniture he had always loved making. Patricia could never find it. Stephen could never mortgage it to pay a bookie. Amanda could never demand to move into the master bedroom. The home belonged exclusively to him, protected by lawful trust and property safeguards. Lawrence looked down at the brass keys resting against the dark wood. He did not break down into a fit of dramatic sobbing. He did not fall to his knees or offer loud, excessive words of gratitude. The ghost of the abused, terrified man who had stood on a rusted motel balcony holding a bottle of pills just weeks ago was completely gone. He reached out and picked up the keys. His hands did not shake. His fingers were steady and firm. He slipped the keys into the pocket of his tailored charcoal suit. He picked up the china cup and took a slow, deliberate sip of the hot tea. A smile spread across his face. It was not a smile of arrogant triumph or malicious victory. It was a smile of profound, absolute peace. I watched his shoulders drop. The heavy, invisible burden he had carried for 46 years simply evaporated into the quiet air of the conference room. He looked at me, his identical twin, the man who had stepped into his personal hell to tear the devil apart from the inside. He gave me a single, silent nod of absolute understanding. The brutal war was over. I was finally and unconditionally free. I picked up my own cup, finished the tea, and set the porcelain gently back onto the silver tray. I adjusted the cuffs of my suit jacket and walked toward the heavy mahogany doors. I did not look back. Some victories do not require long, emotional farewells. They only require the knowledge that the job was done perfectly. I stepped out of the conference room, walked past the empty reception desk, and entered the waiting elevator. The steel doors slid shut, carrying me smoothly down 60 floors to the ground level. I walked out of the towering glass lobby, and stepped onto the crowded pavement of the city. The crisp winter air hit my face cold and sharp. Hundreds of people rushed past me on the busy sidewalks. They carried briefcases, checked their smartphones, and hurried toward their busy, complicated lives. None of them knew the absolute destruction I had just orchestrated in the skyscraper towering above us. They did not know that a ruthless, abusive family had just been completely financially and legally annihilated. They did not know a good man had just been given his entire life back. In the end, true power never shouts. It does not demand applause, seek the spotlight, or beg for validation. True power operates in the absolute shadows. It is the swift, invisible hand that rebalances the ledger when the math becomes fatally corrupted. I merged into the anonymous, bustling crowds of New York, disappearing entirely into the rhythm of the city. There was no cheap triumph. There was only the cold, satisfying perfection of a silent, flawless adjustment. The events that unfolded in that house reinforced a brutal but necessary truth about human nature. Predators do not target you because you are worthless. They target you because you possess a value they wish to consume. My brother Lawrence spent 46 years believing that compliance would earn him peace. He believed that if he just sacrificed his pride, his savings, and his own comfort, his family would eventually return his love. But unconditional surrender to a narcissist only guarantees your own destruction. Boundaries are not acts of cruelty. They are the fundamental architecture of self-respect. When you allow manipulative people to dictate your worth, they will bankrupt your spirit and discard you the moment you are empty. The greatest lesson I learned from dismantling Patricia's fraudulent empire is that true power does not roar. It observes, it calculates, and it strikes only when the trap is perfect.